Hello everyone. I am a storyteller and today I am here to unravel a story that will make you question everything you know. This is not just another bedtime story. This is a journey you wish you had never taken. If you are ready, please like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. It is the most precious gift. It motivates me to continue telling stories. Let me know where you are from and when you watch this video because, trust me, timing is everything. Now, get comfortable, but not too comfortable. Because once you start listening, there is no going back. The house stood there, shrouded in a perpetual fog, like a wound in the landscape. Its stone walls, darkened by centuries of relentless rain from the Trezos Montes Mountains, seemed to pulse with a history no one was meant to uncover. As I approached, a whisper escaped from the cracks in the door, quiet, deliberate, as if something had been waiting for me. I froze. The ancient iron key turned in the lock with a sound that reverberated through my bones. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning as though they hadn't moved in decades. And then an unmistakable scent, old wood, musty air. And something else. Something that felt wrong. It was the breath of the house itself, heavy and stale, as if it had been holding its secrets for far too long. This was my Uncle Antonio's final bequest to me. His only living relative, though, truth be told, we had only exchanged a few words in my 40 years of life. He was a recluse, and his letter had arrived unexpectedly, offering me an academic opportunity to examine his supposed collection of Portuguese folk artifacts from Boston. I had thought it was worth the journey to this remote corner of northern Portugal, but I was mistaken. What I stepped into was far more than I could have imagined. Exhausted by travel, I didn't feel the unease that clawed at my chest when I first arrived. I collapsed into a chair in the study that night, surrounded by shelves filled with ancient books, their leather bindings cracked with age. As I slept, I felt a peculiar weight in the air, like eyes were watching me from the shadows. And when I woke, I found my fingers stained with ink black as midnight. I hadn't used it. The patterns I traced on the chair's arm were like nothing I had ever seen. Symbols, twisted and foreign. They weren't from any alphabet I recognized. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the result of touching something in the dust-ridden room in my sleep. But when the first light of morning filtered through the window, I saw what I had inherited. The house was a maze of narrow corridors and strangely angled rooms, each filled with oddities that should have belonged in a museum of the macabre, not a private collection. Some of the objects were unsettling enough to chill the blood in your veins. There were clay figurines with too many limbs, masks made of bone that seemed to follow my every move, and ritual knives, blades that shimmered, rippling like water when viewed from the corner of my eye. But the most unsettling things were the ordinary objects, children's toys, combs, mirrors that carried a weight of wrongness I couldn't explain. It was as if they were waiting for something only I could bring about. I began cataloging the collection, driven by the need to impose some semblance of order, but as I worked, something strange began happening. Some of the items felt unnervingly warm to the touch, as if they had been recently handled. No one had entered the house but me. And others, they vibrated. A subtle, rhythmic pulse that didn't match the beat of my heart but felt eerily familiar, as though it was calling me to listen. That's when I found my uncle's journals. What I had assumed was the eccentric obsession of a collector was something far darker. His writing, pages and pages of frantic, scrawled entries, revealed a deep descent into madness. His search for objects associated with possession rituals in Portugal, Spain, and North Africa had not been about collecting at all. No. He believed these items were vessels. Anchors for entities that existed in the margins of our world, something waiting. Something far older than time itself. The final journal entries were written in a hand that trembled. They spoke of the collection awakening. Objects had begun to speak to one another. They were communicating, creating a chorus that his senses could almost understand. And then, the unthinkable, "I feel it," he wrote. "They are calling to me. Soon, I will join them. The house has begun to wake. There is no turning back now." I slammed the journal shut, the weight of his words heavy in my hands. It was then I realized. His delusions were beginning to mirror my own fears. That night, I dreamt of the artifacts rearranging themselves. When I woke, I felt something had shifted. The house seemed to be waiting, anticipating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. After a week of restless nights, I invited Helena, a colleague from the University of Porto, to help me examine the collection. She was an expert in Iberian folk magic, and I needed her insights. But what I didn't expect was the panic that gripped her as she moved through the rooms. She took notes frantically, her eyes darting from one object to the next. When she showed me her notebook, my heart stopped. The same symbol, drawn over and over again, a spiral that collapsed inward and then twisted outward, as though it was alive, trapped in a never-ending loop. The story continues to unfold as Helena's visit becomes more disturbing, as the symbols and rituals are revealed to be connected to forces far beyond human comprehension. The atmosphere thickens with dread, leading to a terrifying realization of the house's true purpose. The map on my skin, the grotesque, intricate web of lines that had once seemed like the product of my own madness, was no longer just a personal affliction. It was a guide, an unsettling roadmap that led me deeper into the house. Each line, each path, each branch was a clue, a whisper of the house's true purpose. The patterns on my body mirrored the configurations in the rooms. The placement of the objects, the very architecture of the building. It was as though the house and I were one, a single organism, breathing and pulsing together in a synchrony I couldn't control. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a lingering effect of my time there had consumed my uncle. But then I noticed the cold. It was different now, not just the unexplained drafts or the sudden temperature drops. This cold was deeper, a chill that settled in my bones and radiated from the walls themselves, as if the house was exhaling its own deathly breath. The whispers grew louder each day. Visitors murmured about the uncanny likeness, consciousness. They were no longer distant or foreign. They spoke with a clarity that terrified me. "Come closer," they beckoned. "It is time." But come where? Closer to what? The question gnawed at me. And the closer I got to answering it, the more I realized I didn't want to know. My fingers, stained with ink, began to trace the spiral symbol on the walls of the house as if my hand was no longer my own. I wasn't just mapping the house. I was completing it, assembling its soul, waking something that had been dormant for centuries. I ventured into the attic that night. The map on my skin burning like fire, the cold creeping through the cracks of the old wooden floorboards. The air was thick with dust and secrets. I found a door hidden behind a stack of old crates. Its frame so ancient it seemed to have been swallowed by time itself. But the map led me to it. I knew what I would find before I even touched the door. It was waiting for me. When I opened the door, the room was pitch black, so dark, it felt like the air itself was heavy with darkness. The whispers crescendoed, filling the space like a chorus of ancient voices chanting in a language no human had spoken for millennia. As I stepped inside, I felt the weight of the house press against me, as if it were alive, breathing, and reaching for me. And in the center of the room, bathed in the faintest, sickly light, stood an object. It was unlike anything I had seen before. A statue, perhaps, or a vessel, but its form was neither human nor animal. It was something in between, a twisted amalgamation of shapes that defied comprehension. Its surface was etched with symbols. Symbols that matched the ones on my skin. The map had led me here. This was the final point, the culmination of everything my uncle had sought. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through me, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn open. The whispers surged, louder now, louder than the thunderclap that seemed to shake the walls. The object in front of me pulsed, its surface rippling like water, and for a moment, I saw something. Something beyond the veil of reality. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, stepped from the blackness, its presence so immense that I could feel it pressing against my soul. And then I knew. My uncle hadn't just been collecting artifacts. He had been building a bridge. A bridge between this world and something far darker, far older. And now, I was the final piece. The map on my skin was not just a record of the house's layout. It was a doorway. And I was the key. The object in front of me twisted, its form becoming clearer, less like an object, more like a living thing. A vessel waiting to be filled. And as it reached out to claim me, I understood. The whispers had never been a warning. They were an invitation. An invitation to join the things that waited in the shadows. To become part of the ancient, terrible fabric of the universe that stretched beyond the stars. I was no longer just a man studying a collection. I had become part of it. The house was not just a house. It was a vessel, a conduit for something much, much older. And as the shadows closed in around me, I realized the truth my uncle had uncovered far too late. The house, the collection, the whispers. They were all part of a ritual that had begun long before either of us had arrived. And now, it was too late to stop it. The map on my skin burned. I felt myself slipping away, becoming something else. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with life, as if the building itself was awakening to its purpose. And then, there was silence. But it wasn't the silence of peace. No, it was a silence so deep, so overwhelming, that it seemed to press against every inch of my being. And in that silence, I realized with a chill certainty that I was no longer in control. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed my uncle before me. And the cycle, the terrible, unbroken cycle, was beginning again. I could hear the whispers now, but they were not coming from the house. No. They were coming from inside me. And I knew. I knew with all the certainty in the world that it was only a matter of time before someone else would come. Someone else would find the house, the collection, and the map. And they, too, would be consumed. And when they arrived, they would find the house waiting for them. Ready. Hungry. And it would begin again. In the cellar, amidst the dust and the forgotten remnants of a house lost to time, I found it. A section of flagstone. One among many, that sounded different when struck hollow. With trembling hands, I moved the stone aside. A narrow passageway was revealed. Beneath it, leading down into a darkness that had never been uncovered in all the years of previous exploration. I hesitated, heart racing, before lowering myself down into the unknown. The flashlight's beam wavered as I descended the slick, ancient stone steps, the air thick with the scent of copper and salt. The chamber below defied all logic. It should have extended beneath the neighboring property, cutting through the land like some forgotten secret, yet it did not. This was no ordinary room. I knew instinctively that it existed outside the boundaries of ordinary geography, in a space that bent and twisted in ways that defied the laws of nature. The walls of the chamber pulsed with an eerie, bioluminescent fungus, casting a sickly green light over a circular space that seemed to breathe with the weight of history. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, carved with the spiral symbol that had haunted my dreams. The one I had seen etched into my skin, and now felt crawling under it with an urgency that left me breathless. On that pedestal rested a simple clay bowl, unremarkable at first glance, but as I stepped closer, a terrible realization settled in. It was incomplete. Waiting. My skin burned as I neared it, the map on my body pulling toward the bowl like iron filings to a magnet. The whispers in the walls, once faint and distant, now erupted into a frenzied chorus of demands, in a language I suddenly, horribly, understood. They didn't seek possession. That would imply dominance of one mind over another. No, what they sought was communion, synthesis. A new kind of awareness forged at the intersection of the human mind and an ancient, intelligent force. The artifacts scattered across the house, once thought to be mere vessels for entities, were not what I had believed them to be. They were fragments of something far more terrifying. A dispersed consciousness, collecting itself over centuries, across worlds. And now, it was nearly complete. My hands moved without my direction, pulling items from my pockets that I didn't remember collecting. A bone needle, a shard of broken mirror, a smooth, worn tooth. All scattered around the bowl like a puzzle being assembled by invisible hands. And then, with terrifying clarity, I knew what the final piece was. The one component that would complete the ritual. My blood. The map on my skin burned with such intensity that it felt as if the lines were being traced with fire. I stood there, sweat soaking through my clothes, my heart threatening to burst from my chest as my breath came in ragged gasps. The decision before me was monumental, become the door through which something ancient would step into this world, or walk away, leaving the collection incomplete. The choice seemed unbearable, yet I knew that only one answer would allow the ritual to finish. I wish I could tell you I resisted. That some part of me, that professor of comparative mythology from Boston, remained untouched by the insidious whispers that had infiltrated my mind. That I had fought back against the knowledge I had uncovered. But as my hand reached for the ritual knife at my belt, an item I had no memory of acquiring, I recognized the terrible truth. There was no external force compelling me. No spirit or entity possessing my body. The fragments of consciousness embedded in the artifacts had already merged with mine. They had been doing so since the moment I first set foot in the house. The map on my skin wasn't for them to find their way in. No, it was to show me what I had already become. I left the chamber without completing the ritual, but not out of courage or resistance. I understood now that it was unnecessary. The pieces were already in place. The map was complete. I carefully replaced the flagstone, returning to my uncle's study as if nothing had changed. I began writing letters, first to my department chair, announcing an indefinite sabbatical, then to realtors in nearby villages, inquiring about additional properties. I even contacted museums and private collectors, seeking information on other artifacts that matched the unusual criteria of my uncle's collection. When I looked into the mirror, I no longer saw the map on my skin. But I knew it was still there, hidden. Invisible, yet present. The whispers had quieted, but not because they were gone. They no longer needed to convince me of anything. I had already become part of them. I was both the collector and the collection, the vessel and the content, host and hosted. Visitors still come, colleagues, concerned friends, even potential sellers of artifacts. They leave changed. And sometimes, I press small objects into their hands. Objects I know will start their own collections, their own journeys. They begin to hear the whispers in their walls, to dream of spirals that twist endlessly. And when they write to me, telling me of the visions that torment them, I tell them not to be afraid. After all, we've never truly been alone in our minds. The house stands now as it always has, a wound in the landscape. A wound, yes, but wounds are also openings, places where barriers between thin, separate worlds can touch. I am its caretaker now, just as my uncle was before me. Time stretches before me, endless, as I continue his work, our work, their work. The distinction between us is fading. It hardly matters anymore. The first anomaly appeared on my smartwatch at exactly 3:17 a.m. I wasn't supposed to be awake, but insomnia had become a constant companion. Since I moved into this house, the device vibrated against my wrist, startling me from a restless haze. It was a notification I had never seen before. Dual heartbeat detected. The screen displayed two identical cardiac rhythms, perfectly synchronized, both registering at 72 beats per minute. I tapped the screen, dismissing it as a software glitch. The notification vanished, but the unease remained, settling deep in my chest like the dampness that perpetually clung to the basement of my new home. I had purchased this Victorian fixer-upper just 3 weeks ago at a suspiciously low price. The ornate woodwork, the isolation. Everything about the place had drawn me in, offering the quiet I craved after the chaos of my recent divorce and career change. The real estate agent had mentioned something about the previous owners leaving abruptly, but I hadn't pressed for details. Now, sitting upright in bed, staring at my watch in the eerie blue-tinted darkness of the room, I regretted not asking more questions. Sleep eventually found me, but morning brought no clarity. I examined the smartwatch in daylight, finding no explanation for the anomaly. The device functioned normally throughout my morning routine, tracking my elevated heart rate as I jogged across the property's expansive grounds. The notification didn't return, and by afternoon, I had nearly convinced myself it had been a dream, a manifestation of the stress that had been piling up, but not entirely convinced. That evening, while preparing dinner in a kitchen, that still felt foreign to me. I felt it again, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature. The knife in my hand froze over the half-chopped onion as goosebumps erupted along my forearms. My breath condensed before my face despite the oppressive summer heat outside. The sensation lasted no more than 10 seconds, but it left me standing rigid, knife clutched in my white-knuckled grip. The room returned to normal as abruptly as it had changed. I tried to rationalize it. A malfunction in the ancient HVAC system perhaps, but the seed of unease planted earlier had already begun to sprout. The second incident occurred 3 days later. I was descending the main staircase when my smartwatch vibrated. Once again, the same notification appeared. Dual heartbeat detected. This time, I stopped immediately, standing perfectly still on the 10th step. From the bottom, both heartbeats registered at 83 beats per minute. My actual pulse raced in my ears, far faster than that. I remained motionless, watching the screen, when something made me turn around. Nothing was there, but a floorboard creaked on the landing above, as if bearing weight. My mouth went dry as I heard another creak, then another, mimicking the exact pattern of steps I had taken moments before. The sound stopped precisely where I had paused. I held my breath, ears straining in the sudden silence. That night, I researched smartwatch malfunctions until my eyes burned. I scoured technical forums, looking for answers, but none of the possible explanations mentioned dual heartbeat readings. There were theories about electromagnetic interference, sensor degradation, and environmental factors, but none seemed to explain the phenomenon I was experiencing. I messaged the manufacturer support team, detailing the issue in clinical, precise terms that masked my growing terror. Their automated response promised a human reply within 2 business days. I didn't sleep. Instead, I listened to the house, its creaks and groans, settling around me, as it had done for decades, maybe centuries. At least, that's what I told myself. The sounds were just the house settling. Nothing more than the ancient bones of this place, creaking under the weight of time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The footsteps. The doors opening just after I passed through. Them. The echoes that seemed to follow me. By morning, exhaustion had dulled my senses, but I was hypersensitive in other ways. My mind, deprived of sleep, was on high alert. The walls seemed to breathe with me, the air too still, too dense. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the steam rising from my coffee, unsure of what was real anymore. Was it the house? Or was it me? The dual heartbeat. The footsteps that mirrored mine. The feeling of being followed by something invisible, something just beyond my grasp. Every rational explanation fell apart as the hours dragged on. Something was wrong with this house. Something I couldn't explain, something I wasn't ready to face. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to ignore the growing dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind, but the deeper I delved into this place, the more I realized I might never be able to leave. I shuffled through my routine in a haze, my mind a fog of exhaustion and fear, jumping at every small noise, every creak of the house. During breakfast, the refrigerator compressor kicked on, and I dropped my mug. Coffee spilled across the kitchen floor, a dark puddle spreading out in the wrong direction, toward me instead of away. For a sickening moment, it seemed as though the liquid was reaching out, just as the cold seemed to settle deeper into my bones. Despite the fatigue weighing on me, I decided to go for a jog, hoping that the physical exertion might reset my increasingly erratic thoughts. I needed to feel something tangible, something real. The early autumn air bit at my lungs as I ran along the gravel path that circled the property. The cold, crisp air did little to ease the gnawing discomfort in my chest, but my breathing began to fall into rhythm with my footfalls. Slowly, the tension in my shoulders began to ease, though the weight on my mind never fully lifted. Then my watch vibrated. Dual heartbeat detected. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Chest, faster than the 79 BPM displayed on the screen. It felt like an electric jolt of fear that coursed through me. And I stared at the notification, unable to move. Both heartbeats pulsed in perfect synchronicity. The screen showed a calm rhythm, but in reality, my pulse was thundering in my ears, faster than what the device displayed. Sweat, not from exertion, beaded on my forehead. I slowly turned around. The path behind me empty, stretching back toward the house that loomed against the gray sky like a dark silhouette. But then, a crunch of gravel. Exactly where I had just placed my foot. Another crunch followed, precisely retracing my previous step. And then, another. The invisible footsteps were approaching, matching the rhythm of the second heartbeat on my watch. I froze, dread sinking like lead in my stomach. A surge of primal terror exploded through me, propelling me forward, faster than I had ever run. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for mercy. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. The knowledge that someone, was behind me, mirroring my every movement, was too horrifying to confront. I burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind me. Engaging every lock with trembling hands. My heart hammered in my chest. My breath ragged and desperate. I pressed my back against the wood, straining my ears to hear. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then came 3 knocks, measured, deliberate, spaced exactly like the knocks I had made when I returned from grocery shopping just the day before. My hands full. The rational part of my brain, what little was left, tried to offer an explanation. Maybe a neighbor was playing an elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Something that had attached itself to me. To my every pattern. To my very existence. I called in sick to work the next day, and the day after. My boss asked if I had the flu that was going around. And I clung to that explanation, seizing it as a lifeline. Yes, I told him. Just a fever. Nothing supernatural. Nothing tracking my every movement. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the lies I wasn't saying out loud. Over the following days, I developed a system to cope with the growing terror. I would remain perfectly still whenever the dual heartbeat notification appeared on my watch. Sometimes for minutes at a time, listening, straining, waiting for whatever followed in my wake. Sometimes it was just footsteps, eerie and persistent. Other times, I heard breathing, my breathing, but delayed by 1 second. I stopped wearing the smartwatch. I removed it, placed it in a drawer, and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't forget. Not when the footsteps followed my every move. Not when the sensation of being watched never left me. That night, I dreamed of something worse. A perfect duplicate of myself. Standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with eyes that reflected no light. Its chest rising and falling in rhythm with mine. I woke with a jolt. Heart racing, only to find the smartwatch back on my wrist. Silently pulsing with the same notification. Dual heartbeat detected. Fear had become my constant companion. I couldn't escape it. No matter what I did. The longer I stayed in the house, the more I felt it closing in on me, suffocating me. As though I was no longer alone in my own skin. I began avoiding mirrors. I couldn't bear to look at myself anymore, unable to shake the sensation that my reflection lingered too long when I looked away. The delay between my movements and the entity's response, because I had accepted now that it was an entity of some kind, began to shrink. The footsteps followed more quickly, the breathing almost overlapping with mine. Oh. In my desperate search for answers, I finally contacted the previous homeowner. The conversation was brief, but unsettling. His voice was tight, controlled panic lurking just beneath the surface. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the house?" he asked, his words rushed. When I mentioned the dual heartbeat readings, the line went silent for so long. I thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice was a whisper. Barely audible. "I experienced the same thing," he said. His tone laden with fear. "Before we fled the property." The revelation sent a cold wave of terror through me. The previous owner had known. He had lived through this same nightmare. And yet he hadn't warned me. It was clear now. This house, this place, was not just haunted, it was alive, feeding off the patterns of its inhabitants. And it was only a matter of time before it consumed me completely. He tried to warn others, but who would believe such a story? The real estate company had threatened him with legal action if he continued spreading rumors that could devalue the property. With a final, desperate whisper, he left me with one piece of advice. Never slow down when it's close behind. Never give it the chance to catch up. Completely. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of his words clung to me. As I sat in the kitchen, lights blazing, a pot of coffee keeping me company, My hands shook as I raised the mug to my lips, watching the liquid ripple in tiny concentric circles like the dual lines that had haunted my watch screen. I set the mug down, rubbing my eyes, gritty from a lack of sleep. The temperature dropped suddenly. My breath clouded before me in the otherwise warm kitchen. The familiar vibration against my wrist signaled the dreaded notification. Dual heartbeat detected. But something was different this time. The two lines weren't perfectly synchronized anymore. The second heartbeat was gaining on mine, the delay shrinking until they were almost indistinguishable. I could feel the pressure mounting. The inevitable collision of these two rhythms about to occur. I stood up so quickly that the chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a loud thud that reverberated in my ears. But then, I heard it again. The exact same sound, only a fraction of a second later, as if in an impossibly narrow canyon. I backed toward the kitchen door, each step followed by one more that was growing faster, each footfall falling with more urgency than the last. My pulse raced in my ears, and my mind echoed the previous owner's warning. Never slow down. But what if I did? What if I stopped completely? Would the entity finally reveal itself? Would I see the horror that had been stalking me all this time? A reckless, desperate curiosity gripped me. I planted my feet firmly on the cold tile, then turned around to face the empty kitchen. Nothing stood before me, but the air itself seemed to hum with tension. Compressed, charged with some unseen force. On my watch screen, the two heartbeats began to merge, the peaks and valleys becoming indistinguishable from one another. A chilling question slipped from my lips. What do you want? My voice was hoarse, barely audible. No response came, but the air in front of me shimmered slightly, like heat rising off hot asphalt. I raised my hands slowly, my fingers trembling as I extended them toward the disturbance. An icy sensation shot up my arm as my fingertips breached what felt like a membrane of cold energy. The watch emitted a high-pitched tone that I had never heard before, and the dual heartbeats on the screen began to accelerate in unison, climbing past 100 BPM, then 120. Panic surged through me. I tried to pull my hand back, but it wouldn't move. Someone held it in place, locking it to the shimmering air. The air in front of me began to coalesce, forming a shape that was both horribly familiar and impossible. I was looking at myself, but not as if in a mirror. This version of me was slightly transparent, like a projection, and its movements were too fluid, too perfect. It mimicked my expression of horror, but with terrifying precision. Its eyes, however, remained empty, blank, devoid of the fear that burned in mine. Oh. When it opened its mouth, I opened mine too, involuntarily, as if my body were now the one following a pattern set by something else. No words came. Instead, I felt a pulling sensation, like something essential was being drawn out through my extended hand, slowly, inexorably. The duplicate began to solidify with each passing second, while I felt myself growing lighter, fading, becoming less and less substantial. And then the truth hit me with a crushing clarity. It wasn't just mimicking me. It was replacing me, erasing my existence, slowly, piece by piece, and substituting its own. The smartwatch, the notifications. It hadn't been malfunctioning. It had been warning me. With a surge of frantic strength, I wrenched my hand away, stumbling backward. The connection broke. The doppelganger flickered like a faulty hologram, and I gasped for air, my heart hammering in my chest. My watch displayed a single heartbeat now, erratic but singular. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Fled the house, grabbing nothing but the clothes on my back and my car keys. The smartwatch, though, I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. It was the only thing that had shown me the truth. The only thing that had warned me. The escape was frantic. My mind raced, my thoughts tumbling over one another as I slammed the car door shut, the engine roaring to life. But as the house receded in the rearview mirror, something lingered. A feeling, an awareness that I wasn't alone. That something was still with me. The road ahead stretched out, but I knew deep down that there was no real escape. It was a part of me now. I was part of it. And no matter how far I ran, the entity, my doppelganger, would be right behind me, following my every movement, mimicking my every breath. My only evidence that what I had experienced was real was the relentless, nagging presence of the smartwatch. I drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the house. Somewhere around dawn, I pulled into a motel parking lot. Exhaustion had finally outweighed the terror, and my body screamed for rest. As I reached to turn off the ignition, my watch vibrated. Dual heartbeat detected. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The car trunk, which I had checked before leaving, was now slightly ajar. It closed exactly as I had left it. A shiver ran down my spine as I sat there, staring at the mirror. I hadn't retraced my steps. There had been no way for anyone to get to the car, no time for it to happen. Yet, somehow, it had. I don't stop anymore. I don't retrace my steps. I vary my routine obsessively, never returning to the same place twice. The entity follows, still. But as long as I keep moving forward, creating new patterns faster than it can replicate them, I stay one step ahead. Sometimes, in rare moments of stillness, when exhaustion forces me to rest, I feel it catching up. Its heartbeat aligning with mine, inching closer. In those moments, I glimpse a future, one where I am forgotten, erased completely, while something wearing my face lives my life. Not as an imposter, but as the accepted original, a perfect recording replacing the master track. My watch battery died 3 days ago. I haven't replaced it. Without the warnings, I rely on the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the sudden drops in temperature, and the faint echo of my footsteps growing closer, one step at a time. It is patient. It has all the time in the world. And I know with bone-deep certainty that one day I will falter. I will slow down just enough, and the delay between us will vanish completely. When that happens, there won't be two heartbeats anymore. There will be only one, and it won't be mine. The first night I saw them, I thought I was hallucinating. Muddy footprints that shouldn't exist. They didn't appear because of any storm, or because I had left the door open. No, these footprints were far worse. They glowed an unnatural blue-green under the black light I used to check for scorpions in my old desert house. Worse still, they pointed directly toward my bed, stopping 3 feet from where my head rests every night. At first, I thought I was just tired, exhausted from the stress of moving into this isolated place. But when I examined the footprints more closely, my disbelief turned to horror. They weren't ordinary prints. The mud contained symbols, dates, and markings. Dates from a calendar that doesn't even exist. Events from years that haven't happened, arranged in patterns that should have been incomprehensible. Yet somehow, they made perfect sense to me. And every morning, they were one step closer. I had moved to this house in the Sonoran Desert. After my divorce, seeking solitude, a fresh start far from the city I'd come to despise. The property was cheap, the previous owner having died under circumstances the realtor described as natural but unexpected. I didn't ask questions. I just wanted the quiet. Miles from the nearest neighbor, with only the desert winds and the occasional coyote howl to break the silence. The house itself was unremarkable, single-story adobe with thick walls that kept the brutal summer heat at bay. The only modern addition was the solar panels that powered my minimal electrical needs. My routine was simple. Wake with the sun, work remotely on my laptop until midday. Then spend afternoons painting landscapes or reading. Evenings were for stargazing on the porch, with a glass of whiskey, marveling at skies unpolluted by city lights. I slept dreamlessly for the first time in years, until the footprints appeared. That first morning, I woke to a strange odor in the air, earthy and metallic, like flood water mixed with copper. I thought perhaps a roof leak had allowed rainwater inside during an unexpected thunderstorm. But when I checked the ceiling, it was dry. The smell led me to the foot of my bed, where I found mud on the hardwood floor. At first, this seemed odd enough, but it was the pattern that disturbed me. Clear footprints, leading from my bedroom door to within 3 feet of my headboard. My first instinct was to check the locks, front door, back door, windows. All secure. Deadbolts thrown. Not a sign of forced entry. I lived alone, miles from anyone. There was no explanation for how someone could have entered, walked to my bed, and left without waking me or breaking in. I cleaned the footprints with bleach, convinced they were my own from the previous day, somehow overlooked. But the next morning, the footprints were there again. Closer. I cleaned them again. And the next morning, they were closer still. The same strange pattern. The same unnatural glow under the black light. It wasn't just mud. It was a message. Something was trying to tell me something. I thought I could handle it. I convinced myself that it was just stress, or the heat getting to me. But then the symbols started to change. Dates began to shift, events began to align with things that hadn't happened yet, and the marks started to form a larger pattern. It was as if someone, or something, was drawing a map. A map that led directly to me. I still don't understand why they're following me, or what they want. But I know one thing for certain. The footprints will keep coming closer until the pattern is complete. Until the thing that follows me steps into my life completely. And when it does, I won't be here anymore. Not truly. It will be the one wearing my skin, living my life, as though it's always been the real me. The horror tightens. The entities continue to mimic, to mirror. The boundaries between the self and the other continue to blur, with no escape in sight. This nightmarish journey through the house, the desert, and beyond is just the beginning, and what waits is far worse than anything the protagonist could have imagined. Perhaps I tracked the mud in after checking the rain gauge. My mind was playing tricks on me, that's all. After a shower and coffee, I almost convinced myself it was nothing. But that night, I double-checked every lock, even wedging a chair under my bedroom doorknob, an unnecessary precaution in my empty house. But it helped me sleep. The wind picked up around 2 a.m., howling through the desert scrub. But something in its pitch changed, becoming almost vocal, a low, rhythmic sound that could have been words. A language I didn't recognize. I pulled the pillow over my head and eventually drifted back to sleep, but the unease never fully left. Morning brought the smell again, stronger this time. The familiar earthy, metallic odor. My stomach turned as I stepped into the room, I scanning the floor where I had cleaned the footprints just hours before. There they were again, identical to yesterday's pattern. But now they were closer to my bed. They stopped exactly 2 feet from my pillow. The mud was still damp, as though freshly tracked in. But the doors remained locked, and the chair remained undisturbed. This time, I took photographs, carefully noting the precise position of the footprints. Something nodded me, a hunch. I retrieved the UV blacklight eye used for scorpion hunting, and, with a steady hand, switched it on. The room darkened, and then the glow hit me like a punch to the stomach. The footprints glowed an intense phosphorescent blue, revealing intricate patterns within the mud. Symbols, numbers, what looked like calendar markings. I leaned closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dates were familiar but wrong, showing months and days that made sense but with years stretching far beyond our current decade. The symbols pulsed gently, as though they were alive, breathing. My breath caught in my throat, and I reached out. My hand trembled as I touched one glowing footprint. The mud was colder than the desert morning should have allowed. When I withdrew my finger, I noticed a small smear of luminescent material. Under the black light, I could see tiny movements in the substance, like microorganisms swimming in primordial ooze. My stomach churned. The air felt suffocating, thick with dread. I rushed to the bathroom and scrubbed my hand until the skin was raw. The strange sensation of being watched never left, lingering like a shadow at the edges of my consciousness. After calling in sick to work, I drove 90 minutes to the nearest university to visit an old college friend in the geology department. I brought a sample sealed in a jar, hoping for answers, desperate for answers. Mark examined the sample under his equipment, his expression growing, increasingly puzzled. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically serious. I gave him a vague answer about finding it near my property. His analysis showed elements that shouldn't occur naturally together. He explained that there were trace minerals in the mud that appeared to be undergoing some kind of ongoing transformation. When I asked what kind of transformation, I said, trying to mask my growing unease, he shrugged and said he'd need more sophisticated equipment to determine that. But there was something more in his eyes. A flicker of something, fear perhaps, before he quickly covered it up. He asked me if I'd found anything else unusual, his gaze intense and searching. I lied. No, I said quickly, and left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I positioned a camera in my bedroom, focused on the floor where the footprints had appeared, and sat in a chair facing the door. A baseball bat lay across my lap, the only comfort I had. I watched the clock tick slowly toward midnight. The wind started again, around 12 a.m., bringing with it that same rhythmic, almost language-like sound. My ears strained, trying to decipher it. But my eyes were heavy with exhaustion. Around 3 a.m., the power went out, despite my solar backup system. The camera died instantly. The darkness was absolute. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. When I jerked awake at dawn, I was still sitting in the chair, the bat beside me. The smell hit me immediately, stronger than before, with a sharp ozone quality, like the air after a lightning strike. I stood up and froze. The footprints were now just 1 foot from my bed. The camera had recorded nothing but darkness. Under the black light, the symbols in the mud were more defying, more numerous. I could almost read them now. My stomach turned as I realized the dates, events, and coordinates all appeared to point to a future I couldn't comprehend. A future where I wouldn't exist anymore, and something else would take my place. What disturbed me most, though, were the small symbols that looked like a name. My name, rendered in a script I somehow recognized, though I had never seen it before. My hands shook as I scrubbed away the footprints, the glowing mud clinging to the rag with tendrils that seemed reluctant to let go. In the daylight, I searched the house's perimeter, looking for footprints outside, but found none. The ground was undisturbed, except for my own tracks. I called Mark again. The sample I had given Mark had changed overnight, he told me, his voice tight with either scientific excitement or fear, I couldn't tell which. The molecular structure was shifting in ways that defied explanation. When I asked him what that meant, the line went silent for so long that I thought we had been disconnected. Finally, he asked if he could come see where I had found it. I refused too quickly, stumbling over my words. I made excuses and hung up. That day, I dove into the property's history. The previous owner, Dr. Eleanor Vance, had been an astrophysicist who retired to the desert for its dark skies. Her natural but unexpected death had occurred exactly 1 year ago. Further digging revealed that her specialization had been in theoretical work on closed time-like curves, essentially the mathematical possibility of time travel. The implications of that hit me like a punch to the gut. What if these weren't footprints coming toward my bed, but rather footprints going away from it? What if something, or someone, was visiting me night after night, walking backward through time? A horrifying thought crept into my mind. Was I witnessing a kind of temporal loop? I almost left that afternoon, packed up essentials, and made it halfway down the drive before I stopped. Where would I go? What could I possibly tell people? That mud from the future was creeping toward my pillow? I'd sound insane. And something deeper, some primal instinct, held me back. There was a growing certainty that whatever was happening was meant specifically for me, that it would follow me wherever I went. So, I returned. I installed more lights, placed motion sensors at every possible entrance, and set up multiple cameras recording to a cloud server. I swallowed caffeine pills to stay awake, determined to face whatever was coming. But none of it mattered. The footprints appeared again that night. Now, they were mere inches from where my head would have been had I slept in the bed. The symbols, now fully legible to me, told a story I didn't fully understand, but I knew it was mine. It was my story, with an ending date that was approaching faster than I could bear to face. The mud contained microscopic machines, I realized, not extraterrestrial, but human-made from a technology that doesn't yet exist. They were programmable matter, assembling itself into patterns that could interact with human consciousness across time. The footprints weren't a threat. They were a message from myself. My future self was reaching backward, walking night after night from some point in the coming decade to deliver information critical to both our survival. The world changes dramatically in the timeline recorded in those muddy footprints: environmental collapse, technological singularity, the discovery that consciousness can move through time in ways we never imagined. Tonight will be the final night. The footprints will reach my pillow. I've placed my head there deliberately, waiting. My heart hammers painfully against my ribs. My mouth is dry despite the water I keep sipping. Sweat soaks the sheets, though the night is cool. My mind races between terror and exhilarated anticipation. Will I meet myself face to face? Will the knowledge transfer directly into my brain when the temporal loop closes? Or will the mud simply consume me, pulling me forward to become the version of myself that started this journey? The wind rises outside, carrying that rhythmic, not quite language that I now recognize as my own voice. Distorted, fractured, passing through the dimensional barrier. The lights flicker, then stabilize. On my bedside table, the jar of glowing mud pulses in synchronization with my heartbeat. I lie down, wide-eyed, waiting in the dark, watching the shadows stretch across the room. The clock ticks past midnight, then 1 a.m. The room temperature plummets. Frost forms on the windows despite the desert. Heat that lingered just hours ago, a bizarre contrast that sends chills through my spine. The black light switches on by itself, revealing nothing on the floor yet. But something begins to glow beneath the bed. I hold my breath as the first signs of a footprint begin to emerge. Not from the door this time, but from beneath me, as if rising through the floor itself. The mud bubbles up, forming the now familiar pattern, and I freeze. Too terrified to move. It isn't coming toward the bed anymore. It's coming from under me. It's coming from the future. It's forming in place directly beneath where I lie, rigid with terror and wonder. The symbols in the glowing mud contain tonight's date, followed by coordinates, followed by instructions. My phone chimes with a notification. It's an email from Mark. The sample I gave him has completely transformed. It now contains encoded DNA. My DNA, but with modifications that shouldn't be possible with current technology. Attached is a molecular structure that he says could revolutionize how we understand temporal physics. The mud beneath me pulses one final time, then hardens into a shell that encases my body without touching it. Suspended a millimeter from my skin. I should feel trapped, but instead, I experience a profound sense of connection to myself, to time, to possibility. The shell cracks, and I gasp as cool air rushes into my lungs. The mud dissolves, sinking back into the floorboards, leaving behind a single object on my chest. A small device, like a watch, but with no face, just a button and a set of coordinates engraved on its surface. I recognize the coordinates from the symbols. They point to a location 50 meters deeper into the desert, a place unmarked on any map. The button gleams expectantly in the darkness. My finger hovers over it as dawn breaks outside my window. Whatever awaits me at those coordinates. I understand now that I will eventually return to this room, night after night, leaving footprints from the future to guide my past self toward the discovery. That changes everything. I press the button. The device hums to life against my palm. It's time to make my own footprints. I still remember the first evening I caught a glimpse of her standing at the edge of the tree line, where the moon's glow barely reached. There was something unnervingly silent about the way she blended in with the swaying branches, as though she were part of the forest itself. She wore a long white dress that appeared ghostly under the pale light. In that fleeting moment, my stomach twisted with an inexplicable sense of dread. My heart pounded against my ribs, and my lungs refused to draw a full breath. Little did I know, this brief sighting was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch my sanity to its limits. I had come to this remote estate a few weeks ago, seeking solitude for my botanical research. The property had once been owned by a family of musicians, but it had been abandoned for quite some time. Through scattered rumors in a nearby town, I learned that a pianist once lived here and disappeared under strange circumstances. Nobody spoke of her final days, only that she left behind an old upright piano in the attic. Naturally, I paid little attention to folklore. I was more interested in the wild orchids rumored to grow in the forest behind the house. As a botanist, that was the kind of legend that drew me in. The possibility of discovering a rare bloom, maybe even documenting something unknown to modern science. On my first night, I settled into the creaking house, setting up my small bedroom on the second floor. Right away, I felt ill at ease. A hush lingered in every corner, like even the walls were holding their breath. The floors groaned as I walked, and each step produced a vibration that seemed to echo through the skeleton of the building. When the wind picked up, it funneled through minute gaps in the windows, creating moaning currents of air. Yet, I told myself it was just an aging structure, wood warping, glass panes rattling. Perfectly normal in an old estate. Over the next few days, I busied myself by inspecting the greenhouse out back and exploring the gardens sprawling across the property. The land was lush but had a peculiar pattern of decay. It was not random overgrowth. The plants seemed to be dying in circular formations. Bright green shrubs would suddenly wither around the edges, forming near perfect rings of shriveled leaves. The sight unnerved me, but I convinced myself it could be a fungal outbreak or some other localized disease. I tried to focus on the orchids, hoping to find something extraordinary, something to distract me from the creeping discomfort that gnawed at me. But the feeling didn't leave. It only grew stronger. My specialty is botany, after all. I had studied countless plant infections, and I was determined to identify this one. That determination, however, was overshadowed by a creeping unease. In one corner of the gardens, I saw white roses spattered with what looked like red stains. At first glance, I assumed it was an infestation of insects leaving dark spots. But on closer inspection, my heart pounding in my chest and sweat forming on my brow, I realized the spots were not typical of pest damage. They resembled splashes of liquid. They reminded me of dried droplets of blood. I ran my fingers over the petals, feeling a residue that seemed tacky. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to remain logical. Maybe it was a rare mold or a fungal spore I had never encountered. But my pulse raced and my throat went dry. Something about it was deeply wrong, making the back of my neck prickle with cold sweat. By the fourth night, the oppressive mood of the estate tightened around me. My chest felt heavier every day, as if the air itself was growing denser. I started hearing a faint intermittent noise late at night, like distant, off-key piano notes. I reminded myself of the old piano stored in the attic. Could it be the wind somehow brushing the strings? The notion seemed improbable. But the alternative, that someone was actually playing, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I decided not to investigate that first night, choosing ignorance over a deeper fear. Yet, I lay awake for hours, the dissonant chords echoing behind my eyes. I kept recalling the silhouette I had seen near the forest that first evening. Initially, I had chalked it up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But when I stepped outside one afternoon to collect soil samples, I spotted her again. She was closer this time, not just a blurred shape in the distance. She wore the same white dress, but now the hem looked soggy and stained. My heart thundered. The air around me felt suddenly hot despite the cool breeze. I wiped sweat from my forehead, feeling a growing panic. The question hammered in my mind: why was her dress stained red? Was it mud, algae from the nearby pond, or something more sinister? When I tried to approach, she vanished behind a copse of evergreens. I stood there, heart racing, breath catching in short gasps, until I worked up the courage to follow, but I found only empty shadows. The undergrowth had not even been disturbed. That detail made the hair on my arms stand on end. My hands trembled as I made my way back to the house, struggling to maintain composure. Nighttime offered no relief. My sleep was punctuated by the twisting melodies coming from the attic. Faint piano tunes that never formed a coherent song. They always ended on an off note, as if the unseen player had lost the ability or the desire to finish properly. Each time I heard those dissonant endings, a wave of nausea swept over me. It felt like a signal of something incomplete, something that refused to rest. Night after night, I wrestled with my sheets, face clammy, heart pounding, as though trying to break free of my chest. It was during one of these restless nights that I ventured upstairs with a flashlight. The attic staircase groaned under my weight, every step sending dull echoes through the corridors. The door handle to the attic was ice cold against my palm. Beyond it, the room was a clutter of dust-laden boxes and old furniture, shrouded in cobwebs. In the far corner stood the upright piano. Its lid half open as though someone had just been playing. The flash of the beam on its keys made my stomach lurch for reasons I still cannot fully articulate. It felt like a living presence. An instrument that had grown a consciousness of its own. No one was there, of course. I hovered, breathing in sharp, panicked bursts. My mouth had turned so dry I could barely swallow. My heart hammered a rapid, irregular beat. The single window in the attic let in only a slice of moonlight, illuminating floating dust motes in the stale air. The entire room felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were pressing inward. As the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, I realized the attic was no longer just a room filled with old furniture. It had become something else. A threshold between worlds. Between the living and something else entirely. The piano's haunting melody began again, a ghostly echo that seeped through the cracks in the walls. And this time, I understood. It wasn't music. It was a warning. I forced myself closer to the piano. The keys remained still. Yet, I sensed a quiet vibration under my fingertips when I hovered my hand above them, as though an unseen energy lingered in the air. My sense of unease deepened the following morning when I found strands of black hair in the drawer where I kept my horticultural tools. These were long, silky strands coiled like a serpent on the wood surface. My pulse hammered in my chest. I hadn't had any visitors. I certainly didn't have black hair. My hair is short and brown. Even so, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a clump of hair had gotten mixed in with the supplies I brought from the local market. But that explanation felt flimsy. Shaken, I threw the hair away. Over the next few days, though, I discovered more strands in various places. Inside my coat pocket, under my pillow, and even beneath a stack of botanical notes. As I tried to focus on my research, the plants around the estate worsened. Their leaves curled inwards, turning a sickly gray. And entire patches would rot overnight, always in near-perfect circles, as though following the path of some invisible plague. The white blooms were particularly jarring. Large, lovely petals that would, overnight, appear splattered with red. Each new ring of decay made me feel like I was being corralled toward the house, as if the forest were intentionally shrinking. My heart would race uncontrollably every time I saw another ring. Sweat forming on my temples, a queasy feeling in my gut. I tried taking samples, analyzing soil pH levels, but the results revealed nothing conclusive. I found no typical fungal or bacterial presence that could explain the pattern. This was something else entirely. Something I had no rational name for. I spoke occasionally with the caretaker from the neighboring property, though always indirectly. He was the one who told me about the disappearance of the pianist. He claimed she went into the forest one night and never came back. He never used the word died, but his tone suggested that no one expected her to return. My blood ran cold as I listened, my heart pounding. A fine layer of perspiration forming on my face. I wanted to ask if she had black hair, but I stopped myself. The caretaker never offered more details, and I sensed that my direct questions would be met only with uneasy silence. As the nights wore on, I began to notice changes in my reflection. It started with small things, like the shape of my eyes or the line of my jaw. I dismissed these at first, blaming poor lighting in the bathroom mirror. But one morning, as I studied my face in the mirror under the strongest daylight I could find, I realized my cheekbones looked sharper, my lips thinner, and my features had a distinctly feminine quality. The shock sent my heart racing, and I broke out in a cold sweat. I turned away from the mirror, refusing to confront that warped reflection. Eventually, I dared to examine my reflection more closely in the garden's shallow pools of water. To my horror, I no longer saw my own face looking back. Instead, I caught a fleeting glimpse of her face, the same woman in the white dress. She stared back, expression impassive, but her eyes were hollow as though she were trapped on the other side of the water's surface. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. My lungs tightened, making it impossible to breathe for a few seconds. Sweat poured at the base of my neck, and my hands shook so violently that I almost dropped my notebook. Every logical thought in my head screamed that this could not be real. Yet, my racing heart and trembling body knew otherwise. I tried to flee the estate altogether one afternoon, packing up a few essentials and getting into my old Jeep. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered uselessly. After repeated attempts, I gave up, only to step outside and realize all four tires were inexplicably flat. As I circled the vehicle, my eyes fell on the ground beneath each tire, where withered grass had formed a perfect ring around the rubber. My mouth went dry. Panic rattled through me like an electric current. It felt as though the very land was conspiring to keep me here. That night, the dissonant piano melody returned, louder than before. It drew me up to the attic once more, despite every inch of my body screaming in protest. The hallway leading to the attic felt longer than it should have been, like I was walking down a corridor that stretched beyond the physical dimensions of the house. My breathing was shallow, my pulse thundering in my ears. My flashlight flickered, and in those moments of darkness, I swore I could feel a presence brushing past me in the narrow space. When I reached the attic, the piano was playing by itself. No visible hands pressed the keys, yet the sound reverberated through the rafters. I stood frozen, each note sending tremors through my spine. My breath came in short gasps, sweat stinging my eyes. Then the melody ended abruptly on another dissonant chord, jarring me like an electric shock. In that suffocating silence that followed, I felt something move behind me. I spun around, heart thumping so hard I thought my chest would burst. No one stood there, but I smelled a faint, sickly scent of wet earth and decaying flowers. The same odor that clung to those red-stained rose petals. My skin crawled and the hair on my arm stood at attention. I stumbled backward, half convinced I was losing my mind. Then I felt a strand of hair brush against my cheek. Reaching up, I found a long black lock that had somehow fallen onto my shoulder. In my confusion and terror, I slammed the attic door behind me and rushed downstairs. My feet nearly slipped on the steps, and my heart felt ready to give out. That evening, I barricaded myself in the study, refusing to let the darkness and the piano's melodies overtake me. My mind raced, trying to piece together the events. The woman in white, the changes in my reflection, the hair, the bizarre patterns of plant decay. Everything felt connected to the missing pianist, as though she was reaching across some boundary, trying to take something back. My own face, my own essence, seemed to be slipping away. When the sun's rays finally broke the horizon, I forced myself outside to the gardens. I needed answers, or at least a last stand of courage. The morning air was crisp, but my skin felt clammy, sweat pooling along my hairline. My heart hammered as I neared one of the shallow reflecting pools. As if compelled by some dreadful curiosity, I knelt down and looked into the water. Her face stared back at me, more vivid than before, with eyes so dark they seemed endless. But this time, I fought the urge to recoil. I glared back at that reflection, determined not to let it consume me. In that moment, I remembered something the caretaker had whispered indirectly, that some believed the pianist was bound to the estate, wandering the halls, searching for someone to finish her final piece. My entire body tensed, and my breath grew rapid. perhaps she was clinging to whoever was foolish enough to stay in her old home. The reflection's mouth curved into what might have been a faint, sorrowful smile. My throat felt tight, and I tried to steady my breathing. I dipped my trembling fingertips into the water. The reflection shimmered and fractured, then returned to my own face. My features still slightly altered, but undeniably mine again. A jolt of possibility coursed through me. Maybe there was a way to break whatever tie she had formed. I rushed back inside, ignoring the trembling in my hands and the sweat soaking my collar. I headed straight for the attic, flung open the door, and approached the piano. I didn't know how to play a single note properly, but I sat on the dusty bench, placing my hands on the cold keys. My chest felt constricted, my heart racing. The air in the attic felt thick and stale. I started hitting keys at random, each note a clumsy attempt. My fingers felt guided by a force not entirely mine. Oh! Stumbling through the same haunting melody I had heard all those nights. As the final sequence approached, I braced myself for the usual dissonance. My heart thundered, and beads of sweat rolled down my temples. But at the last moment, I forced my fingers to shift, completing the chord in a more harmonious progression. The piano rang with a resonance that felt almost alive, as if the instrument exhaled a sigh of relief. This marks the turning point in the story. The protagonist confronts the haunting force that's been tying them to the house, the woman in white, and her unfinished symphony. By playing the final chord of the melody, something neither the ghost nor the house wanted, the protagonist takes control. However, the relief is short-lived, as the mysterious nature of the house and its eerie history still clings to them. In that instant, a rush of cold air blew through the attic. The hair on my arm stood up, and for a second, I swore I heard a whispered note of gratitude, too soft to be certain. I stood up, my entire body shaking with fear and exhaustion. Downstairs, the house seemed eerily quiet. Outside, the plants remained in their dire state, but I had the strangest sense that the suffocating dread was lifting. My reflection in the hall mirror looked more like my old self, though I couldn't ignore the lingering sharpness in my cheekbones. My eyes darted around, expecting the woman in white to appear again, her dress dripping red. Yet, she didn't. The property felt subdued, as if it were catching its breath after a long ordeal. I realized I could no longer stay here, even with the dread seeming to lessen. Something about the estate felt irreparably tainted. I spent the next hours repairing the Jeep's tires and recharging the battery. Despite the tension coiling in my gut, I managed to restore the vehicle to functional condition. All the while, I braced myself for the woman to reappear, or for the piano to echo more dissonant chords. But the night remained still, and I felt a tangible distance from that haunting presence. At the break of dawn, I loaded my sparse belongings and drove away, leaving the estate behind. My heart hammered the entire journey down the forest road, each bump in the path feeling like a jolt to my already frazzled nerves. When I finally passed the iron gates, I caught sight of something in the rear-view mirror. A pale figure stood at the top window of the house, watching me depart. Even from a distance, I sensed the red stains on her dress. A final reminder of the horror that had nearly consumed me. To this day, I can't fully explain the phenomena I encountered. The circular patterns of decay, the hair in my drawers, or the shifting lines of my face. My hands still tremble when I recall the dissonant piano melodies. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I imagine that I can hear a single forlorn key pressed somewhere in the darkness. My reflection is mostly normal again. Yet occasionally, I catch a flicker of something else in the mirror, a fleeting shadow. A suggestion of that other face. It's a reminder that some forces are not meant to be fully understood or controlled. I escaped the estate. I'm free, at least in the literal sense. Yet the memory of that place and the presence that lingers there remains tangled in my mind. It leaves me with a persistent sense of unease, and a biting question that has no answer. Did I really leave her behind? Or did I take a part of her with me when I drove away? I have no certainty, only a perpetual knot of dread in my stomach. And the echo of a final unfinished chord. I remember waking to the echo of a heartbeat that didn't seem like my own. It reverberated through my ears. Slow and rhythmic, like someone tapping on the inside of my skull. There was a faint antiseptic smell in the air and a coldness on my skin that I associated with hospital sheets. I had survived something. I could feel it. But the moment my eyes fluttered open, I sensed an unsettling presence lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. It was like a static buzz at the edge of my consciousness, reminding me that I was no longer alone in my own mind. I'm an engineer by trade, accustomed to precision, logic, and tangible solutions. So, when I first regained awareness after my near-death experience, I was confident I could rationalize whatever came next. I could dissect it, break it down into steps, and find an explanation. Yet, in the hours following my surgery, I discovered that reason can crack when it collides with the unknown. The hospital corridors looked the same as any other facility. Bland walls, artificial lighting, and pungent odors of bleach and medication. But beyond the standard sights, I began to perceive another layer of reality. Translucent shapes, distorted figures that hovered near patients' beds or clung to them like parasites. They had half-formed faces and elongated limbs curling around suffering people as if siphoning their pain. At first, I convinced myself it was a side effect of the anesthesia. My head felt heavy, my mouth dry, my limbs sluggish. His comments sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't noticed the scars myself, too distracted by the increasing strangeness of my surroundings. I had been focused on my recovery, convinced that my body would heal quickly. But now, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister at play. The marks on my skin had an unnatural symmetry, and as the days went by, they seemed to change. They appeared almost like a map, tracing paths that led across my body in lines that felt too deliberate to be random. The next day, I asked the nurse to help me inspect the scars. Her reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. She paused, then quickly excused herself, telling me it was nothing to worry about. That it was likely just a side effect of my body's rapid healing. Yet, her response felt forced, and I couldn't shake the unease that filled the room. As she left, she lingered by the door for a moment too long, eyes darting nervously to the corner of the room before she shut the door behind her. That evening, I had a strange dream. In it, I was walking down the hospital's endless corridors, feeling the familiar pressure of something lurking just behind me, closing in. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the usual sterile smell of antiseptic was replaced by the smell of wet earth, like the odor of freshly dug soil. I turned a corner, only to find myself in a room I'd never seen before. The walls were lined with shelves containing various objects. Blue light. The room felt wrong, oppressive, and the symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with the eerie heartbeat that filled the space. As I stepped forward, I heard the faint sound of piano keys playing. Distant but unmistakable. The music seemed to draw me in, as though it were calling me closer. But when I reached the piano, I saw her again. The woman in white, standing motionless beside the instrument. Her eyes were wide, empty, and as I reached out to touch her, she suddenly turned her head, her mouth opening in a silent scream. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I sat up in my bed, gasping for air, feeling like I had just been holding my breath underwater. My body was drenched in sweat, and I couldn't shake the image of the woman in white, her eyes locked onto mine. The next day, I ventured deeper into the hospital's hidden sections, the ones I had been warned to avoid. I was driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, as though the answers to everything that was happening lay buried within those forgotten halls. As I moved further into the building, the corridors became narrower, more claustrophobic, and the air grew colder. The sounds of the hospital faded away, replaced by the eerie hum of something unseen. In one of the rooms, I found a set of files, meticulously organized, detailing the history of the hospital and its patients. The records were old, some of them dating back decades, others disturbingly recent. The deeper I read, the more I realized that the hospital had been a site of unspeakable experimentation, its true purpose hidden behind a veneer of medical care. The symbols etched into the walls, the strange entities I had seen. All of it made sense now. The hospital wasn't just treating patients. It was conducting experiments, testing boundaries of consciousness and time itself. The entities I had seen, those translucent shapes feeding off pain, were not mere hallucinations. They were manifestations of the suffering, the anguish that had been bottled up within these walls. They were tied to the hospital's experiments, and now I had become a part of it. I turned a corner, and to my horror, I found myself face to face with one of the entities. Its form was clearer now, more defined, like a shadow cast on a foggy day. It reached out toward me, its elongated fingers twitching as it made contact with my skin. The sensation was like ice running through my veins, paralyzing me with fear. I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped, locked in place by its gaze. Then, I heard the voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder as it echoed through the room. "You are one of us now," it said, its tone both mournful and commanding. "The cycle must be completed. There is no escape." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The hospital, the entities, the strange markings on my skin, all of it was part of a larger, incomprehensible design. I wasn't just a patient here. I was a subject. A part of a ritual that had been unfolding for decades, perhaps longer. And now, I had crossed a point of no return. With all the strength I could muster, I broke free from the entity's grip and ran. I didn't look back, not even once. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out of the hospital. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I kept running, driven by a primal instinct to survive. I finally reached the exit, bursting through the heavy doors and into the night. The air outside felt different, fresher, but still heavy with the weight of what had transpired. I stood there for a moment, gasping for air, trying to make sense of everything. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, never left me. As I stood there in the dark, I realized something chilling. I had escaped the hospital, but I hadn't escaped the hospital's grip. The entities, the symbols, the whispers, they were still with me. And as I walked away, I knew one thing for certain: the cycle wasn't over. It had only just begun. My pulse quickened as I approached the door. The symbols surrounding it seemed to throb in time with my heartbeat. I reached out to touch the barrel, my fingers trembling as I brushed against. As soon as my skin made contact, a jolt of energy surged through my arm, as if the door itself were alive, responding to my presence. A low hum vibrated in the air, and for a moment, the walls seemed to lean in closer, their oppressive weight bearing down on me. I hesitated. I could feel the weight of its secrets pressing down on me. Something that had been waiting for this moment. Something that had been waiting for me. My mind raced, but my body was already moving. Drawn to the door as if I had no choice in the matter. The knob turned easily beneath my hand, and with a creak, the door swung open. The room beyond was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't a typical storage area or abandoned wing of the hospital. The walls were lined with shelves containing various objects. Old medical equipment, files covered in dust, and jars filled with what looked like preserved organs or strange, unidentifiable substances. But it wasn't just the objects that unnerved me. It was the presence. In the center of the room stood an altar, bathed in a sickly green glow. Atop the altar lay an object that immediately caught my eye, a small, spherical device, resting on a cloth that had been intricately embroidered with symbols matching the ones on my scars. My heart raced as I stared at it, feeling as though it was pulling me in. I took a cautious step forward, drawn to it against my better judgment. As I moved closer, the air thickened with a coldness that I could feel down to my bones. The room seemed to warp around me, distorting in a way that made my vision swim. The symbols on the walls flickered in and out of focus, as if they were shifting in real time. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out to touch the device. The instant my fingers made contact with it, I was plunged into darkness. My body jerked violently, as if an invisible force had taken hold of me. I was floating in a void, weightless and disoriented. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat sending waves of fear through my body. And then, I saw it. The woman in white. She appeared before me, her face now unmistakably clear. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes burned into mine, hollow and empty. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind, rather than my ears. "You were never meant to understand." I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up. But my body didn't obey. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The woman's image flickered and shifted, merging with the dark void around me. Her voice grew louder, more urgent. "It is too late now. You are already part of the cycle." The sensation of being trapped, suspended in this endless void, felt suffocating. The pain in my chest worsened, and I gasped for air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman in white reached out, her fingers brushing against my skin. Her touch was icy cold, sending a shock through my entire being. And then, I was back in the room, collapsed on the floor beside the altar. My mind reeled, still trying to process what had just happened. The symbols on the walls flickered one last time before fading away. The device lay on the altar, as still and silent as before. My hand hovered above it, trembling. I knew now. I had crossed a line, something I could never go back from. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing, it was a gateway. A conduit between realms, a place where time itself bled into the present. The ritual, the scars, the symbols, they were all part of a larger plan. And I had become a part of it. I could feel the walls pushing in on me. Clarity. I wasn't just a victim in this game. I was the key. My body, my soul, my very existence had been tied to this in-between space. And now, I was bound to it. The hospital wasn't just a physical location. It was a node in a larger system, one that connected the past, present, and future. My escape had been an illusion. The moment I stepped foot into this place, I had sealed my fate. And now, there was no way out. As I continue to write, the darkness that clings to my memory refuses to fade. I've tried to convince myself that I've escaped, that the horrors of the hospital are behind me. But every time I close my eyes, I feel the weight of the scars on my skin, the cold pulse beneath them, as if they are calling me back. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, my body still aching from the trauma, and hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a lingering effect of my time there. But now, I wonder. The voices are always the same, low, distorted. Like the sound of someone trying to communicate through thick, heavy glass. The more I listen, the more I recognize patterns within the words. Fragments of sentences, repeated phrases. It feels like they're trying to get through to me, to pull me back into that cold, sterile place where they remain. Trapped. It's become harder to distinguish between what's real and what's not. I'll find myself standing in the middle of a room, wondering how I got there. I'll glance at my reflection, only to find my features momentarily blur and warp, like a glitch in a digital image. For a split second, I see someone else. A woman with hollow eyes, her face obscured by a white dress. Then, just as quickly, the image vanishes, and I am left standing in front of the mirror, alone. What disturbs me the most is the feeling that I am being watched. Not by anyone physical, but by something unseen. Something tethered to me through the scars, through the symbols etched into my flesh. I don't know how much longer I can keep up this fight. There are days when I feel as though I'm losing my grip on reality. And yet, I can't stop moving forward. I can't let go of the hope that if I keep moving, if I keep resisting, I will outrun whatever force has latched onto me. But I know deep down that the real terror lies in the fact that I may never be free. I've crossed a threshold, and no matter how far I run, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that place, the shadows will always follow. The road ahead is uncertain. But I will not stop writing. Not yet. I have to make sense of what happened. Of what they did to me. Perhaps, in telling this story, I can break the cycle. Perhaps, by sharing my experience, I can help others see the warning signs, recognize the symbols, and break free before it's too late. But if you're reading this, know this, the scars are real. The entities are real. The hospital is not just a place, it's a prison. And as long as those symbols remain on my skin, I'll never truly escape. The visions grew more intense, flashing images of faces contorted in anger. Voices rising in heated arguments. The sounds became overwhelming. Muffled yet piercing, as though I could hear the echoes of past emotions. Trapped within the walls of the dining hall. My mind screamed for me to pull away, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen in place, unable to escape the vivid memories seeping through the food. Just as the sensation became unbearable, the scene vanished as quickly as it had come. The bustling sounds of the present returned. The clinking of silverware, the low murmurs of the other guests. My breathing was shallow, my skin clammy, and I felt as though I had just awakened from a nightmare. But I hadn't been asleep. I wiped my forehead, unsure of what had just happened. Was it a result of exhaustion? Or was something more sinister at work? I tried to continue eating, pushing the disturbing images out of my mind. But the stew tasted different now. Each bite seemed to trigger more memories. More flashes of a distant past. Faces I didn't recognize. Yet they seemed so familiar, standing in a vast, candle-lit hall. The sensation of cold, hard stone beneath their feet. The palpable weight of regret and sorrow in the air. I couldn't escape the feeling that the whispers would follow me. Was somehow pulling me into its history, forcing me to relive moments I had no connection to. I pushed the bowl away, suddenly unable to eat another bite. My appetite vanished, replaced by an uneasy feeling that settled deep in my stomach. The waiter noticed my unease and swiftly cleared my plate. He didn't speak, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. As if he knew exactly what I had experienced. The rest of the meal passed in a blur, the flavors now neutral, the atmosphere thick with tension I could not place. When I returned to my room later, the oppressive sense of the house continued to weigh on me. I tried to shake it off, convinced that I was simply being overly sensitive. But when I lay down to sleep, the carved headboard above me seemed to twist and shift in the dim light, the swirling patterns now taking on a life of their own. I stared at them, my heart racing, as though the symbols were reaching out to me, beckoning me to understand their meaning. Something in the patterns seemed familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would offer a reprieve. But as I drifted off, I heard a faint whisper, like a breath, barely audible but unmistakable. Find the truth. It is within you. I awoke with a start, my body slick with sweat. The room was silent, still, as if nothing had happened. But the weight of the words lingered in my mind. Find the truth. What did they mean? And why did I feel as if the house itself was waiting for me to uncover something hidden within its walls? I couldn't ignore the growing sensation that the guest house, the food, the portraits, even the very air around me, were all part of a web. A complex design I had been pulled into without even knowing it. Whatever it was, I was bound to it now. And I had a feeling that the answers I sought could only be found by delving deeper into the strange history of Abados. The stories that had been woven into its very fabric for centuries. As I lay there, unable to sleep, I knew one thing with certainty. I had to uncover the secrets of this place. I could feel them pulling me, drawing me deeper into a labyrinth of memories, emotions, and history that I wasn't prepared for. But I had no choice. The truth was waiting, and it was something I had to face, no matter how terrifying it might be. And so, the next day, I set out once more, determined to uncover whatever dark history this guest house hid, hoping to understand the connection between the unsettling culinary experience and the eerie, impossible place I had found myself in. But little did I know, I was only beginning to scratch the surface of a mystery that would change everything I thought I knew about food, memories, and the power of the past. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, unable to move as the figure flickered and disappeared into the air. The man in the frock coat had appeared as solid as anyone else, and yet, as he passed through the wall, it felt as though he had stepped right out of the past. My heart raced in disbelief, but I convinced myself that it was a trick of the light, a symptom of the fatigue and stress I had been enduring. Still, the sensation lingered, gnawing at me. The house felt like it was built on the intersection of multiple realities, as if time had folded itself in on itself, blurring the lines between then and now. I tried to shake the thought, dismissing it as absurd. But the more I explored the guest house, the more these strange occurrences piled up, one after another, until they couldn't be ignored any longer. On the fourth day, I ventured into the library, hoping to find some answers. The air inside was thick with dust, the shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten books. I ran my fingers along the spines, brushing off centuries of neglect. Then, tucked away in a corner, I found a collection of journals bound in cracked leather. They looked old, really old, but not so ancient that they were beyond reading. As I flipped through the pages, I realized the manuscript was a journal. They weren't written in a modern hand, but in flowing cursive, written by someone who had clearly known the house intimately. The entries were filled with strange observations about the house's ability to pull people across time, to entangle their memories with the past, and to bind them to the fate of those who had lived there before. Each journal entry described vivid, almost prophetic visions of gatherings in the dining hall, and the strange sensations people experienced when they partook in the meals prepared for them. The more I read, the more I understood. The food served here was no ordinary cuisine. It was laced with ingredients From another time, carefully crafted to provoke intense emotional responses in its eaters. The chef, it seemed, had learned how to brew flavors that could open doors to the past, allowing people to feel, see, and even relive moments they had never lived themselves. I slammed the book shut, the overwhelming knowledge almost too much to process. If the journal was correct, then everything I had experienced, every strange vision, every fleeting appearance of people from another era, was tied to this place and to the food. The guest house was a vessel, a space that bound people to its history and its creators. And, I realized, I had unknowingly walked right into its trap. The thought left me breathless. I couldn't escape now. Not without facing what lay at the heart of this place. I had unwittingly become part of the story, and to break free, I had to understand its true purpose. The food was the key, I knew that now. But it wasn't just about the ingredients. It was about the emotions, the connections, the shared history that had been woven into every dish served. My mind raced as I tried to process everything I had just learned. I knew what I had to do next. I had to return to the dining hall, face the final meal, and confront the source of all these strange, shifting memories. But deep down, I feared what I would uncover. The evening arrived far too quickly. When I stepped into the dining hall, I was greeted by the same polite hostess. Her eyes met mine. And for the first time, I felt truly terrified. Not because of what I could see. Something knowing. She led me to my usual seat, her fingers brushing mine as she set the plate down before me. The dish before me was simple. A stew of some kind, but it looked different this time, darker, heavier. As I raised the spoon to my lips, I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. Every bite was like a key turning, unlocking more memories. More visions of those long-forgotten gatherings, of arguments, of rituals performed in the shadows. And then it happened. I felt a pull in my chest, a pressure, as if my very essence was being drawn into the past, tangled with those who had come before me. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, I was no longer sitting at the table. I was standing in the middle of the dining hall, surrounded by people I didn't know, in a time I couldn't place. The faces of the men and women around me were hazy, but their eyes were sharp. They were speaking, but I couldn't understand their words. They gestured toward the food, toward me, and then back toward the door. I tried to move, but my feet were glued to the floor. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I realized that I had become part of the very fabric of this place, tied to its past in a way that I couldn't undo. The music swelled, and I recognized it, those same dissonant chords that had haunted me in my dreams. The argument echoed in my mind once more. Louder this time, sharper. My heart raced as I fought to break free, to escape the pull of the house, but it was too late. The meal had sealed my fate. The stew had been the final catalyst, and I had become a part of it. I could feel the walls pushing in on me. The room swirled around me, and I knew then that I was no longer just a guest. I had become part of its history, bound by the meals I had eaten, the memories I had experienced. There was no leaving now. Not for me, and not for anyone who came after. Panic set in as I examined the threads on my skin, each one pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, as though alive and binding me to something far beyond my understanding. The metallic filaments seemed to stretch in intricate patterns, like a design that was both part of me and something else entirely. My body felt foreign, as if I were no longer just a guest in the house, but something that had become woven into its very fabric. My breath came in shallow gasps as I touched the threads on my chest, hoping for them to disappear, but they remained, shimmering under my fingertips. Desperately, I rubbed at the spots, but the sensation was as though my skin had absorbed these strange markings, fusing them with my very being. It felt like the house was rewriting me, altering me at a molecular level. I stumbled to the window, my mind spinning. The house loomed outside, its silhouette darker and more oppressive than ever. I could feel the weight of its secrets pressing down on me, pulling me towards something I couldn't escape. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling centuries of accumulated memories into the still air. I had to leave. I knew that now, with every fiber of my being. I couldn't stay here any longer. Not with whatever was happening to me, not with the twisted connection that had taken root between my body and the house. But the thought of leaving was complicated by the growing realization that I couldn't fully escape. There was something tethering me here, something stronger than my desire to flee. I returned to the receptionist, my face pale with fear. I demanded answers. What was happening to me? Why were my body and mind being altered by this place? Her response was almost cryptic. She told me that the guest house was alive, but not in the way I expected. It fed on memories, on emotions, on the essence of those who passed through its doors. And those who stayed too long, well, they became part of its eternal cycle. She spoke of guests who had come and gone over centuries, their memories and emotions permanently imprinted into the walls, the floors, the very air. Their spirits were woven into the very structure of the guest house, unable to move on. And those who stayed long enough, those who allowed the house to feed on them, would become part of its legacy, their essence forever bound to its halls. The room seemed to close in around me as I tried to absorb her words. The terrifying truth began to settle over me like a heavy fog. I wasn't just a visitor here. I was becoming a part of it. Slowly but surely. My body, my mind, my very soul were being absorbed into the house's history. I had become a living thread in the tapestry of its eternal cycle, and there was no escaping it. Desperation surged within me. I had to get out, had to break free from the grip of the house. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had already been marked, that I had already been claimed by this place. The metallic threads on my body were the house's way of tethering me, of ensuring that I would never leave. My footsteps faltered as I made my way toward the door. The house seemed to resist, its walls shifting in subtle ways, as if it were trying to stop me from leaving. I could feel its presence behind me, watching, waiting. And as I stepped into the hallway, I heard it. The faintest whisper, like the rustling of fabric, followed by the sound of a piano. It was the same dissonant melody that had haunted my dreams. The same unsettling tune that seemed to weave through the house like an inescapable thread. I froze, unable to move, unable to ignore the pull it had on me. The music seemed to come from all directions, wrapping around me, drawing me back toward the dining hall. I stood there for a long moment, paralyzed by the sound. Then, without fully understanding why, I found myself walking toward the source of the music, unable to resist the pull. As I entered the dining hall, the sight before me sent a shock through my body. The room was filled with guests, but they were no longer human. Their faces were contorted in agony, their features half-formed, frozen in expressions of pain. They sat at the long table, their eyes staring at me. And the music continued to play, the same dissonant chords ringing out, as though it were being played by the very walls themselves. I felt a cold wave wash over me, and for the first time, I realized that I had not been a guest in this house. I had been part of its collection of memories and emotions. I had become one of the many lost souls who had been claimed by the guest house, and now I would never leave. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the piano's final note, a single, lingering chord that echoed through the house, fading into silence. I stood at the edge of the vineyard, taking in the sight of rows of grapevines stretching into the distance, but everything about the landscape felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. A low murmur, faint but insistent, vibrated through the soil beneath my feet, and for a moment, I almost thought I could hear the land itself whispering, telling me something, warning me. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on lack of sleep from the long journey, but the discomfort in my chest grew with every step I took deeper into the vineyard. The vines appeared healthy, their leaves green and lush. Yet they seemed to shimmer, to ripple in the early morning light. The longer I stayed, the more I felt as though I were being watched. Though when I turned around, no one was there. The strange sensation followed me as I moved toward the main house. The building loomed ahead, its silhouette half obscured by fog and twisted branches from the nearby trees. The house was old, its stone facade weathered by time, but still imposing. It had been abandoned for years, at least, that's what I had been told. But as I got closer, I began to wonder if the stories I'd heard about its haunting past weren't just local legends. The door to the house was ajar, and a cold draft seeped out, carrying with it the scent of wine, mildew, and something else, something metallic, as if iron had been freshly oxidized. I stepped inside, my feet crunching on the dust-covered floor. But the door swung shut behind me with a loud bang that echoed through the empty halls. A sudden shiver ran down my spine, and I paused, taking a deep breath. I made my way down the long corridor, passing portraits of men and women I didn't recognize, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. The house had the feeling of something still alive, as if it had memories, secrets embedded in its walls. Stories of sorrow and struggle that it longed to tell. But there was no one left to listen. The further I went, the darker the house became, as though the shadows were closing in. I couldn't help but notice the fine, intricate patterns etched into the walls. Patterns that seemed to form symbols, like the ones I had seen etched into the glass of the guest house back in Aboto's. My pulse quickened, and a creeping sense of dread settled over me, a feeling I couldn't explain but could no longer deny. I reached what appeared to be the main room, a grand space with high ceilings and large windows. The view should have been breathtaking, fields of grapes stretching out to meet the horizon, but instead, the landscape seemed suffocated, as though the earth itself had been constrained. I looked down at the floor, my eyes drawn to the old wine barrel in the center of the room. Its wooden sides cracked and stained with what could only be blood. A voice in my head told me to leave, to turn around and run as fast as I could. But my body wouldn't listen. I felt anchored to the spot, as though some force beyond my control had rooted me there. I reached out to touch the barrel, my fingers trembling as I brushed against its weathered surface. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, and the air was filled with the sound of a distant, slow heartbeat, pulsing from deep within the earth. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I turned toward the door to leave, but it had disappeared. Where there had once been an exit, there was now only a wall, cold and immovable. Panic surged through me as I tried to find another way out. But every door I opened led to another corridor, another room that felt both familiar and completely foreign. The heartbeat grew louder, reverberating through my bones, until it was all I could hear. The walls around me seemed to pulse, shifting like the ink of the manuscript. Ancient force, a living entity that had been waiting, perhaps for centuries, for someone like me. I could no longer tell if I was walking or floating, as though my body had detached from itself. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures that flickered in and out of existence like half-formed memories. And then, as I turned yet another corner, I saw her. She stood in the doorway, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were dark, empty, as if she had been waiting for me for a very long time. She wore a dress made of vines, the fabric twisting and changing with every breath she took. Her presence seemed to draw the very light toward her, leaving the room darker and colder than before. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy. She lifted her hand, pointing toward the center of the room. And there, in the shadowy depths, I saw the heart of the vineyard, a massive, gnarled tree with vines that seemed to pulse and throb, just like the beating in the walls. The realization hit me like a wave. The vineyard was not just a place of growth, but a vessel. Its roots burrowing deep into the earth, feeding on something ancient, something dark. And I had become a part of it. The moment my feet touched the soil, the vineyard had claimed me. The woman stepped closer, her face shifting as though it were made of the very shadows she was born from. "You're here," she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo all around me. "Now, you belong." The room darkened completely, the heartbeat a steady thrum against my chest. And as her hand reached out toward me, I knew there would be no escape. The vines tightened around me, pulling me deeper into the roots of the vineyard, and I was no longer sure where I ended and the house began. My body dissolved into the earth, and the last thing I heard was the whisper of the wind and the soft pulse of the heart of the vineyard, calling for its next soul to claim. My eyes scanned the page, and my hands trembled as I turned to the next entry, reading about the effect the wine had on the workers who had tasted it. The notes described a sort of intoxication that went beyond the physical. An obsessive compulsion, a pull to return to the vineyard again and again, despite the risks. The viticulturist warned that those who drank the wine seemed to become bound to the vines, as if their souls were intertwined with the plants themselves. I couldn't bring myself to read further. The words seemed to weigh on me like a curse. My mind raced as I tried to digest what I'd just uncovered. The idea that something as innocent as wine could have such a dark and powerful influence felt absurd. Yet, the oddities I'd witnessed in the vineyard, the strange patterns in the vines, and the figure that mirrored my own movements, all seemed to suggest that something deeper, darker was at play here. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. The rhythmic sound of the wind moving through the vines outside seemed to grow louder, almost like whispers. Voices I couldn't quite understand but felt in my bones. I got up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtains. The vineyard stretched out before me, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. And for a moment, I felt at peace. But then, I saw it again. The figure in the distance. This time, it wasn't just a silhouette. The figure was standing motionless among the rows of vines, facing me, mirroring my own stance. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time, I felt fear, not the fear of an intruder or an animal, but the deep, gut-wrenching fear of something otherworldly. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, driven by an urge I couldn't explain. My feet carried me toward the vineyard, toward the figure that mirrored my every move. As I got closer, I saw the figure's features become clearer, the same height, the same posture, but with an expression I couldn't quite make out. It was like a mask, one that didn't quite fit. As I stepped into the rows of vines, the air thickened, and I felt an unnatural chill run down my spine. The ground beneath my feet felt strangely alive, as if the soil itself was breathing. I reached out to touch one of the vines, and that was when I felt it. An overwhelming wave of heat, like the plant was pulsing with life. The moment my fingers brushed against the vine, I saw it. The vines around me seemed to shift and move, forming intricate patterns that looked like symbols, like runes from another time. I staggered back, my heart racing, and then, the figure spoke, his voice low and familiar. But not my own. "They are watching," he said, his words a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble as the figure began to move toward me. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, my body paralyzed by an unseen force. His eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, everything around me went still. The air grew heavy, and I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my ears. The vines behind him seemed to grow, twisting and curling, almost as if they were reaching out, yearning for something. "The vines speak with blood," the figure said again, his voice now full of both pain and longing. "The wine is not just for the body. It is for the soul, and the vines are its vessel. You will understand soon." A flood of images suddenly overtook my mind, flashes of the vineyard's past, of the viticulturist, of the workers who had come and gone. I saw them all, their faces twisted in obsession, their eyes hollow and distant, as they returned to the vineyard over and over, unable to leave. I saw the vines growing stronger, feeding off their devotion, feeding off their blood, until they became one with the land. I broke free from the vision, gasping for breath, and stumbled backward, my body trembling. The figure, or whatever it was gone. But the vines continued to shift and move around me. I turned and ran back toward the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like I was being dragged deeper into something I couldn't escape. When I reached the house, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hand shook as I tried to steady myself. I could still hear the whispers, the pulsing of the vineyard outside, and the faint echo of that voice, telling me that I had become a part of something far bigger than I ever imagined. The next morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the vineyard, again, unable to look away from the rows of vines. They seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to return. I knew that I had become part of this place, part of its curse. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the vineyard would always be with me. The vines had claimed me, just as they had claimed everyone before me. And the wine, its intoxicating power, would forever be a part of me. The vineyard, alive with its blood-soaked legacy, would never release me. I was bound to it, just as those before me had been bound, and now I would remain a part of its endless cycle. The whispers of the vineyard would never stop. The vines would continue to grow, and I would continue to be its vessel. "The land knows," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle into the air between us. "It remembers the blood that was spilled here." He paused, as though the words held more meaning than he was willing to share, and then quickly turned away, leaving me standing in the field, chilled by the eerie implications of his statement. I couldn't shake his words. The vines, the strange behavior of the workers, and now this cryptic talk of blood, it all seemed to point to something far darker than I had ever imagined. The very earth beneath my feet seemed to hum with an ancient energy, as if it had a life of its own. And it was not a life that could be ignored. I had unknowingly walked into a place where the boundaries of time and reality seemed to shift, where the past bled into the present with the force of a haunting tide. Each day, the air grew thicker with the weight of something unspoken. The vines, once a beautiful symbol of nature's grace, now felt like something more, like a manifestation of an insidious force. Something that could never be fully understood, but whose presence was unmistakable. The changes in the staff were becoming more pronounced, too. The vacant, glassy eyes of the workers, their mechanical movements, and the lack of any individual will in their actions spoke volumes of a dark control at work, as if they were all being bound to the vines in some twisted ritual I had yet to uncover. I had to confront this. I could no longer ignore the pull of the vineyard, its ancient hunger, and the terrifying truth that perhaps it was me, too, who had been slowly, inevitably drawn into its web. I had tasted the wine. And I had seen the results of that intoxicating elixir. The pull of the vines had already begun to sink its tendrils into me, weaving through my veins, like the very roots of the plants themselves. The nightmares became more vivid, more disturbing. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sensation of my skin stretching as though it were being drawn into the earth. The phantom aches in my limbs were worse now, almost as though my body was being consumed from the inside out. A victim of the vineyard's insatiable thirst. I began to wonder. Was I becoming part of this place? Was I meant to stay here, bound to the land, the vines, and the blood that had once soaked this soil? One evening, in a fit of desperation, I returned to the cellar. It was the only place that still felt like a sanctuary. A place where I could possibly find some answers. I descended into the darkness, again, determined to uncover the truth. I pried open another barrel, the sickening stench of the wine filling the air once again. This time, I collected a sample and studied it under the dim light. But as I held the wine in my hands, I could see something that had escaped my notice before: tiny, faint patterns swirling inside the liquid. Like symbols too small to be identified but too deliberate to be random. I drank the wine again, against all reason, but this time, the sensations that overwhelmed me were different. The familiar euphoria gave way to a gnawing, deep terror, as though I were crossing some invisible threshold, one that I couldn't come back from. The room spun, and the walls seemed to bend and twist. In the reflection of the wine, I saw something I couldn't fully comprehend myself, but not quite. I was still me, but there was something else there. Something lurking beneath the surface. I dropped the glass, and it shattered on the cold stone floor, the sound ringing in my ears. The darkness seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in, the vines outside calling to me. The floor beneath me felt as though it were alive, shifting beneath my weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. As if something was crawling inside my skin, pulling me toward the vineyard. The vines, now so much more than mere plants, reached out with phantom tendrils, grasping for me. And then, I saw him again, the figure that resembled me, standing in the doorway. This time, he stepped forward. His eyes locked with mine, and his expression was one of knowing. As if he understood exactly what was happening to me. "You cannot leave," he whispered, his voice thick with the same euphoria I had tasted. "The land is a part of you now. And you are a part of it." I stumbled back, panic surging through me. I had to escape. But escape from what? From the vines? From the land? Or was the real escape from myself, from the pull that had drawn me here in the first place? My mind whirled, the realization hitting me with the force of a train. I had been drawn here, marked by the vineyard's ancient hunger. And there was no way to break free. As I turned to flee, I could feel the vines reaching for me, the very ground shaking as the estate began to consume me. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the figure's voice, soft and insistent, saying one final thing. "You will return, just as the others have. You cannot escape what was already written." As I approached the driveway, I could feel their eyes on me. Cold and unwavering, like they were waiting for something. Watching for my next move. There was no need to speak. Their silence spoke volumes. I tried to push forward, my footsteps quickening. But it felt as though the very air around me had thickened. Each step a battle against the unseen force binding me to this place. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, motionless. But just as I was about to step beyond the threshold, I felt it, an overwhelming, invisible pull, like something or someone was holding me back. The ground beneath my feet seemed to sink slightly. As if the vineyard itself had claimed my presence, unwilling to let me leave. I staggered back, an icy chill crawling up my spine. I turned to face the staff once more. They hadn't moved. Their figures like statues, but there was something in their stillness. An unspoken command. The vines behind them seemed to twist and sway in an unnatural rhythm, as though they too were aware of my decision to leave. The leaves rustled like whispers of something ancient, something hungry. The reality of the situation hit me like a cold wave. I had not been drawn into this vineyard by mere coincidence. No, I had been chosen, marked by the very land, its vines, and the ritual that had been set in motion long before my arrival. The figure that mirrored me, the strange wine, the disturbing visions. It was all connected, a part of a much larger, more sinister design. I was not just a witness to this cycle, I was becoming a part of it. Woven into the fabric of the vineyard's twisted legacy. My mind raced. I had to escape, but I could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on me. The estate was not merely a building, it was a living entity. A place of ancient power that had claimed me as its own. The walls, the vines, the air itself, they were all connected. Part of a system that fed off my presence. The vines had tasted my blood. And now they were calling me back, not just to feed on my fear, but to make me one of them. I could hear the whispering again, louder this time. It was coming from the vines, from the ground, from every corner of the estate. It was a beckoning, a call that was impossible to resist. I looked back at the staff, their eyes still fixed on me. Their faces expressionless yet filled with an unmistakable expectation. They knew that I had become part of this place, and they were waiting for me to accept my fate. I took a step back, the fear surging through my veins. But at that moment, something inside me snapped. I refused to be claimed by this land, to let it consume me completely. With every ounce of strength, I forced myself to turn away from the vineyard, the staff, and the vines. I broke into a run, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. Away from the estate, away from the suffocating pull that had sought to claim me. I ran until the estate disappeared behind me, until the sound of the vines and the whispering faded into the distance. But even as I escaped, I could feel the vines still tugging at me, still whispering, still trying to pull me back into their endless cycle. The memory of the figure that mirrored me, the sensation of being watched, and the haunting presence of the vineyard would stay with me forever. I didn't know if I had truly escaped, or if part of me remained tethered to that place, still bound to the vineyard's twisted legacy. The marks on my body, the changes in my veins, the unnatural synchronization of the staff, they all pointed to one undeniable truth. I had become part of something far older, far darker than I could ever have imagined. And no matter how far I ran, I could feel its call echoing through the very blood in my veins. The whispers grew louder each day. Visitors murmured about the uncanny likeness, and I couldn't ignore the discomfort creeping up my spine every time I overheard them. What if they were right? What if something about that painting had latched onto me? The figure in the background, now clearly moving ever closer, had begun to bear an unsettling resemblance to myself. The eyes of the others around the table, once merely unsettling, now seemed to follow me, their gazes becoming too focused, too aware. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, pulling me into its dark, oppressive world. I found myself growing increasingly distant from reality. Simple tasks became harder. I spent longer and longer staring at the painting, mesmerized by its slow transformation. I couldn't tear myself away from the strange pull it had on me. The longer I stayed near it, the more I felt like a part of it. Bound to the figures, the atmosphere, the strange weight that pressed down on me. One afternoon, as I cleaned the area around the frame, I noticed something terrifying. The figure in the back, the one who had mirrored my likeness, had shifted again. His posture was slightly different, his face now a near-perfect reflection of mine. It was as if the painting had absorbed me, layer by layer, until I could no longer tell where I ended and it began. My pulse quickened, my mind spinning as I realized the figure in the painting wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a reflection of me. Something more than just a portrait, something far more sinister. That night, the nightmares escalated. I dreamt I was in that candlelit room. My eyes locked with the figure who mirrored me, and I felt myself being pulled toward him. His outstretched hand seemed to beckon me into the darkness of the past. I could feel his cold fingers brush against my skin. But when I reached out, I could no longer see my own hand. It was as if my reflection had merged with his, my own body disappearing into the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of that long-forgotten room. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. My reflection in the mirror was different now. I didn't recognize myself. My features were distorted, as if I had already crossed over into the painting's world. I tried to shake off the panic, but the feeling of being drawn into that other time, into the world of the painting, was undeniable. Each morning I stood in front of the mirror, waiting for the moment when my own face would dissolve completely, when I would cease to be a curator, a person, and become just another figure trapped in the painted world. Desperate, I turned to my colleagues. I couldn't continue like this. But how could I explain what was happening without sounding mad? When I shared my concerns, they smiled indulgently, dismissing it as stress or exhaustion. But when I mentioned the figure's resemblance to me, their faces froze. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence was worse than any answer they could have given. I began to fear that I had already crossed a point of no return. The longer I remained in the presence of the painting, the more I could feel my identity slipping away, absorbed into the figure that mirrored me. One day, I came into the gallery to find the painting had been moved. It now hung in the center of the room, its haunting eyes fixed directly on me. The whispers had become unbearable. Everyone who came near the exhibit looked at the painting, looked at me, and whispered among themselves. I felt their eyes on me, their recognition of something I hadn't fully accepted. It was as if the painting itself was reaching out, pulling me back. I was no longer in control. One night, after closing the gallery, I couldn't take it any longer. I approached the painting with a sense of inevitability, as if I had no choice but to confront it. My heart raced as I stood before the canvas, the air thick with an electric charge. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the painted surface. The instant I made contact, I felt a jolt, a shock that surged through my body. As if I had connected with something ancient and powerful. The painting seemed to breathe. The figure's eyes flickered. The shadows in the room lengthened. For a split second, I saw my own reflection in his eyes, not as a person, but as a fleeting part of the painting itself. I stumbled back, my mind spinning, and I knew then that the painting had claimed me. I was no longer just the curator, I had become a part of its story. A part of the silent, eternal conversation unfolding within that canvas. I fled the gallery that night, leaving the painting behind. I've not returned since. The figure in the painting still watches me in my dreams. And sometimes, when I pass by mirrors, I swear I see a fleeting glimpse of him, a shadow of his presence flickering in the glass. I don't know if I ever truly escaped. What I do know is that the painting, and the world it holds, continues to call me back. I stood there, trembling, trying to gather my thoughts. The oppressive weight that had pressed on me for so long began to ease, but only slightly. My heart was still racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The gallery felt too quiet, too still, as if the very air had thickened in response to what had just occurred. I didn't understand what had happened, but in that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had resisted the painting's pull, at least for now. But even as I took a step back, I knew that it wasn't over. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The painting still held a part of me. Something intangible and dangerous. Its influence had sunk so deeply into my soul that I knew it would never truly let go. I turned away slowly, my legs unsteady as I moved towards the exit. The echoes of my footsteps in the empty gallery felt unnaturally loud, as if they were a part of something far larger and more terrifying than I had realized. I didn't sleep that night. The haunting visions continued to visit me, fragments of the other world I had brushed against. The corridors of the museum twisted into those dark, candle-lit rooms. Figures moved in and out of my line of sight, their expressions unreadable. Sometimes I felt myself slipping again, caught in the grip of that painting, its allure too strong to fight. But I held on, clinging to the thin thread of my own identity, telling myself I had to resist. The next few days were a blur of numbness and fear. I continued my duties as curator, but each time I passed by the East Wing, I felt an intense urge to look at the painting. I fought it, pushing forward with only the faintest resolve. But the idea of it, the idea of that face staring at me from the canvas, had lodged itself deep in my mind. My colleagues, though concerned about my behavior, said nothing more. They didn't need to. I could feel their unease. And I knew they felt what I had come to realize, that painting had affected us all. One night, as I sat in my office, I received a letter. It was hand-delivered by a messenger I didn't recognize. Inside the envelope was a simple note: "The painting remembers. You are not free." My blood ran cold. The words were simple, but their implications were horrifying. Had someone else seen what I had seen? Had they too come to the same conclusion? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The painting wasn't just a work of art. It was alive, a vessel that captured the essence of the people it depicted. And it had chosen me. But the question remained, was I a part of it now? Had I become a permanent fixture in its cursed tableau? I couldn't answer that. But I knew one thing for certain: I had become a part of its story. And it would never release me. I tried to leave the museum. But every time I did, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. It was as if the painting itself was reaching out, pulling me back. My reflection in the mirror beside the desk flickered, warped for just a moment. Doppelganger I had seen in the gallery. Every time I looked at myself, I saw a flicker of someone else's face, a face that wasn't entirely mine. The nightmares never stopped. Each night, I would find myself back in that parlor, those dark, shadowy figures surrounding me, their eyes boring into my soul. The painting, always watching, always waiting. And sometimes, I felt the ground beneath me shift, as though the very reality I inhabited was crumbling, dissolving into the painted world. It was a slow, insidious process, a gradual suffocation that I couldn't escape. Now, as I sit here, writing these words, I wonder if I am still in the museum. If I am still a part of that world. My reflection flickers in the glass, and I catch a glimpse of the figure from the painting staring back at me. Is it my own reflection, or is it something else entirely? Perhaps, in the end, we are all just shadows on canvas, waiting for the brushstrokes that will define us. And for me, that moment is far from over. I could sense the weight of the building, the centuries of forgotten lives embedded within its walls. It was a curious thing to feel, especially in a place that was supposed to be a temporary home. The walls of the apartment seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't place, the air heavy with a sense of waiting. I tried to shake it off as nothing more than the anxiety of a new place. But something about the atmosphere didn't sit right. As I moved through the apartment, my fingers grazing the old wooden furniture, I felt a connection to something older than I could understand. The bookshelves, packed with dusty volumes of ancient texts, seemed to whisper in languages I didn't recognize. I dismissed it as my imagination running wild, but as the day drew to a close and I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air in the apartment seemed to thicken, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I turned off the lights, trying to drown out the sense of being followed by invisible eyes. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't ignore the unease settling in the pit of my stomach. It was as if the room itself had a pulse, a rhythm that mirrored my own, breathing in time with me. The first night passed without incident, though my dreams were strange. The walls of my apartment seemed to shift and pulse in my sleep, the faces of unfamiliar people staring at me through the cracks. In the morning, I chalked it up to stress and fatigue. But as the days went on, I began to notice more unsettling things. Objects that weren't where I had left them, faint scratching noises coming from the walls at night, and the unmistakable feeling that I was never truly alone. One afternoon, while going through the apartment's library, I stumbled across an old manuscript tucked away behind a row of forgotten books. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. As I flipped through the pages, I realized the manuscript was a journal written by the apartment's previous tenant. His entries were filled with strange, cryptic language, descriptions of rituals and symbols, and notes on the history of the building. The more I read, the more my skin crawled. The previous tenant spoke of a strange presence in the building, something that seemed to feed on solitude and silence, growing stronger the longer one stayed. The journal entries became increasingly frantic, detailing strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, shadows moving against the grain of the light, and the terrifying feeling of being drawn toward the walls, as if they were alive and pulling him in. I couldn't put the journal down. Each word seemed to pull me deeper into the story, as if I were becoming a part of it. The last entry was a chilling one. I can feel it now, the walls are closing in. I can hear the whispers in the dark. They want me. They've always wanted me. That night, the feeling of being watched never left me. It wasn't a passing sensation. Noises again, but this time they were louder, more deliberate. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I couldn't pinpoint the source. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, trying to rationalize the situation. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something far beyond what I could explain. The next day, I decided to confront the building's history. I visited the local library, hoping to find more information on the apartment's previous tenants. What I uncovered was unsettling. The building had a long history of strange events, many of which were tied to the presence of an old, mysterious symbol that appeared throughout its construction. The symbol was said to be a doorway, an entry point to something darker that lurked in the space between worlds. The more I read, the more it became clear that the building had been built with a purpose. To trap something, to contain it. And now, I was a part of it. I could feel the pull growing stronger, a weight in my chest that I couldn't ignore. The walls, once solid and familiar, now felt like they were closing in around me. I tried to leave, to pack my things and flee from the apartment. But the door wouldn't open. It was as if the building had decided I wasn't going anywhere. I pressed my hands against the door. But it felt like there was something behind it, something pushing back. My heart raced, and for the first time since moving in, I truly understood the gravity of my situation. The apartment wasn't just a place, it was a prison. As I backed away from the door, I turned to face the room. The walls seemed to pulse with life. The shadows now deeper, darker. The whispers I had heard before now seemed to be in my mind, taunting me, telling me I would never leave. And then, as if summoned by the building itself, I saw it. A figure in the corner of the room. A shadow, darker than the rest. Standing motionless. It was my reflection, but not mine. Its features were twisted, unfamiliar, and its eyes stared back at me with a cold, knowing gaze. The figure stepped forward, and I froze, unable to move. The shadow seemed to swallow the light, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind, or if the apartment itself was feeding other world entirely. My reflection stepped closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I don't know what happened next. All I remember is the sound of my own breath. Ragged and shallow, as the room seemed to close in around me. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was a whisper. Soft and mocking. "You're not leaving. You belong here now." When I opened my eyes, the room felt heavier, the shadows deeper. My breath hitched in my chest as I looked around, but nothing had changed. The books were still arranged in odd clusters, the strange words still present. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a trick of the mind. But my fingers were still trembling as I reached out to rearrange them. The letters formed words again, clearer now, stay and oby. Almost like a message, though I couldn't make sense of it. A sense of unease settled deeper within me. I could almost hear the apartment breathing, a low hum that echoed in my mind. The quiet murmurs I had dismissed. As my own exhaustion now seemed to be growing louder, more deliberate. The soft scrape of furniture shifting. The faintest sound of breathing. Not my own, that stirred the air around me. I stood up quickly, needing to escape the oppressive silence. I decided to step out. To get some fresh air. Maybe I just needed to clear my head. I locked the door behind me, the quiet click of the lock seeming strangely final. The cobblestone street was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The sun was setting, casting a muted orange glow over the buildings. Yet the space around me seemed uncomfortably still, as though the world had been paused. As I walked, the oppressive feeling from inside the apartment seemed to follow me. It clung to the back of my neck. Invisible, but undeniable. After walking for a few blocks, I stopped by a small cafe. I ordered a drink to settle my nerves, hoping that the warm cup would bring some comfort. But even as I sat there, the feeling of being watched never left me. It wasn't a passing sensation, but a weight and invisible gaze following me, always a beat behind. I could feel it, in every passing stranger, in the quiet stillness of the street. By the time I returned to the apartment, night had fully fallen. The windows reflected the dim light from the street lamps outside, casting eerie silhouettes in the room. I tried to force myself to work again, to ignore the strange unease, but as I sat down at my desk, I felt it again. The pressure behind me, that sense of being watched. My heart raced as I turned around, but the apartment was empty. Still, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thicker, colder. It seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I walked through the rooms, checking for anything out of place, but found nothing. Yet, the feeling remained. Every corner I turned felt like it was closing in. Every whisper of the wind carrying the faintest echoes of something ancient. The walls felt alive with some kind of hidden presence, pressing closer. Watching, waiting. As I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the situation, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, vibrating through the walls. A whisper, almost a growl, curling around the edges of my mind. Stay. The letters on the bookshelves flashed again in my mind. The pattern now clear, the warning unmistakable. Stay. There was no other message, no other words. Just the command. My head spun, and a wave of nausea surged through me. My reflection in the mirror beside the desk flickered, warped for just a moment. I could see myself, yes, but there was something off. The edges of my face seemed to blur, stretch. For a fleeting moment, I saw not myself but something else, standing in my place, watching me. A wave of panic rushed through me, and I rushed out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap, but even the chill couldn't clear the fog in my mind. The streets were empty now, silent and desolate. The city felt wrong. The air thick with an unnatural stillness. I couldn't breathe. I had to leave. I had to run. But no matter where I turned, the city seemed to pull me back. To pull me toward that apartment, that door. I ran. My footsteps echoing in the empty street, but the weight of the apartment's call was unbearable. I couldn't escape it. The air was heavy, suffocating, and every corner I turned seemed to bring me closer to it. I knew that somehow I would return, even if I tried to run. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the darkness of my temporary refuge, heart racing, staring at the shadows that seemed to dance just beyond my sight. I knew I had not escaped. I had only delayed the inevitable. The presence that had watched me, that had followed me, was still there, waiting for me to return. And somewhere deep down, I knew I would. And then, there it was. A book, out of place, resting on my desk where I had not left it. I had not touched it since I moved in, but now it sat open. A dark red stain bleeding into the pages. I recoiled, stepping back as my mind raced to comprehend. The book was old, ancient even. Its cover cracked and faded. The stain was unmistakable. It was blood. My hands felt numb as I shuffled through the pages, my mind reeling from the implications of what I had just written. The storm, the destruction, it was all there, detailed with unnerving precision. It was as though my hand had moved without my will, like a puppet to some unseen master. And yet, the events described were no longer just predictions, they were becoming real, inch by inch. Like a terrifying prophecy unfolding before me. 2:16. 58. Panic set in as I ran my hands through my hair, trying to steady my breath. The thought of leaving the apartment, of running away from whatever this force was, crossed my mind, but the weight of the situation pinned me down. Where would I go? What could I do? The apartment, the tea, the books. It all seemed too connected to be a coincidence. And I was starting to feel that perhaps I had already crossed a point of no return. The doorbell rang, breaking my spiraling thoughts. My heart leapt in my chest. Who could it be? I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Hesitantly, I approached the door, my hand shaking as I turned the knob. On the other side was a man I didn't recognize, dressed in dark clothing with a solemn expression. He seemed to stare through me, his eyes unnervingly hollow. "I've been looking for you," he said in a voice so calm it chilled me. "I see you found the book." I stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The hairs on my neck stood up as he stepped forward without invitation, his presence commanding the space. He didn't wait for me to speak. "You've seen what it does. Felt it, haven't you?" His words were slow, deliberate. "The paintings, the writings, they are all part of it. And now, so are you." I backed away from him, heart racing, my pulse thrumming loudly in my ears. I hadn't known how far into this I had fallen, but in that moment, the reality of the situation hit me with full force. This wasn't just some bad dream. This wasn't a product of stress or exhaustion. Something far more sinister had its grip on me. "You must leave this place," he continued, his gaze darkening. "It has chosen you. And you've already begun to change." I shook my head. a mixture of disbelief and terror flooding my senses. I can't. I've tried. I can't leave. His expression softened, but only briefly. It won't let you. But there is still time. The key is in the book. You have to destroy it. My legs felt weak beneath me, and I clutched the edge of the door to steady myself. This man, this stranger, spoke with the certainty of someone who had seen this before. He stepped back, giving me space, but his eyes never left mine. Find the truth, he said quietly, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the dimly lit hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me with nothing but silence and the weight of his words hanging in the air. I stared at the door, my mind racing. A part of me wanted to dismiss him, to pretend that everything was fine. But the way he spoke, the way he knew, it felt like the final warning. There was no turning back now. I looked back at the papers on the desk. The words "Write, Create, Give" still spelled out on the bookshelves. The room felt suffocating, and I could feel the air itself pressing against me. It was all too much. I had to destroy the book. But how? How could I destroy something that had already woven itself so tightly into my life? I felt like a marionette, strings pulled by something far more powerful than I could comprehend. Every time I tried to move, it pulled me back, keeping me tethered to this place. The doorbell rang again. And this time I didn't hesitate. I knew it was him, the man from before. He had returned. I braced myself for whatever was about to happen. My thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and dread. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Only the empty hallway, bathed in the dim light of the street. Lamps outside. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding. Had I imagined it all? Had the force in the apartment started to invade my mind, making me question everything? I closed the door slowly, my mind in turmoil. Whatever it was that had begun this journey was far from over. The whispers, the visions, the painting, the writing. It was all connected. I wasn't sure if I was even still in control anymore. The weight of the apartment grew heavier with each passing minute. The walls creaked, the floorboards seemed to sigh under my feet. And the air was thick with an unspoken presence, like a living, breathing entity that didn't want me to leave. I tried to ignore the rising panic clawing at my throat, but it was impossible to shake the sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. I grabbed my suitcase, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I rushed to the door. The key turned in the lock with an unsettling finality. I could almost hear the apartment protesting, the faint rustling of fabric, the sensation of being surrounded by unseen eyes. But I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The streets of Queenborough outside felt surreal, as though I had stepped into a dream. The cobblestones beneath my feet seemed to shift with each step, and I could feel the city pressing in on me. The old buildings loomed like silent watchers, their windows dark and lifeless. I clutched my suitcase tighter, the only sound the rapid beating of my heart. At the train station, I thought I was finally free. The noise of people bustling, the clink of coins, the rush of engines. Everything felt so normal, so ordinary. But the moment I boarded the train, I felt the shift again. It was subtle at first, a light pressure in my chest. But it quickly grew, like the air was thickening, the space around me narrowing. I could feel the eyes of the passengers on me, even though they never met my gaze. As the train started to pull away, I glanced out the window, my heart skipping a beat. In the distance, the apartment building stood stark against the skyline. But there, at the window of my old room, was the figure. The librarian, her hollow eyes staring directly at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. She raised her finger to her lips in that same chilling gesture. Stay silent. Stay. Right. Panic surged through me as the city blurred into the distance. My mind raced, thoughts crashing together in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Had she followed me? Was I safe? Could I ever truly escape? The weight of her presence, like a dark shadow, hung over me, even as I physically left the place behind. The train ride felt endless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those hollow, empty eyes. I could hear her whispering in the back of my mind, urging me to write, to give in. Her presence was inside me now, like a parasite, feeding on my thoughts, draining my energy, leaving me a hollow shell. Every page I had written, every word I had spilled onto the paper, felt like a piece of me was being consumed, lost to some dark, intangible force. I arrived at my destination hours later, but I didn't feel relief. I had managed to escape Queenborough, but the feeling of being tethered to that cursed apartment, to that cursed library, still clung to me. My hand reached for my suitcase, and a sickening realization hit me. The pages, those cursed pages, had somehow followed me. They were still there, tucked into the folds of my clothing, hidden in my bag. I pulled them out in a daze, trembling as I scanned the predictions that had come true, each one more horrifying than the last. And there, at the bottom of the stack, was a new page written in my own hand. It read, "You can never leave. You are mine now." The words on the page blurred before my eyes. My vision swam, my heart thudding painfully against my chest. I was no longer sure where I ended and where the library began. The line between the world I was writing and the world I was living in became since dissolved. The darkness, the endless writing, the librarian. It was all part of me now. The train rumbled to a stop, but I didn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the growing certainty that I would never truly escape. I was trapped, bound to the forces that had claimed me, like an insect caught in a spider's web. The words on the page blurred again, and I could hear her voice in my mind, the librarian's voice, urging me to write once more, to continue the cycle. I dropped the pages to the floor, my hands trembling. I knew then that I had no choice. I was part of this now, and it was too late to turn back. Back in the archive. The musty smell of ancient paper and dust overwhelmed me as I spread the manuscript across the table. It felt strangely warm to the touch, as though it had been waiting for me. My hands trembled as I unbound the fraying leather cover, revealing pages yellowed with age but surprisingly well preserved. The text was written in an unfamiliar script, with characters that seemed to shift under the dim light. I leaned closer, heart pounding, eager to decipher the meaning of each word, each curve of the ink. The strange symbols seemed to whisper to me as my eyes scanned the pages. They were not just words, they were alive, pulsing with an energy that I couldn't explain. A cold chill crept up my spine, but my curiosity pushed me onward. The manuscript spoke of forbidden knowledge, lost languages, and ancient rituals that could bind the soul to the written word. I felt as though the text was reaching out, pulling me into its depths, enticing me to understand more, to learn the secrets hidden within. As I continued reading, the words seemed to change, to adapt to my thoughts. They whispered in my mind, their meaning shifting with each passing sentence. I could hear the faint echo of ancient voices, and for a moment, I felt as though I had stepped into another time, another world. The wind howled outside, but inside the archive, the air was thick with silence, oppressive and heavy. I felt my own breath grow shallow, as though the manuscript was stealing the very air from my lungs. I flipped to the final pages, where the script grew darker, more frantic. The ink seemed to bleed from the pages, as though the text was being written in real time, right before my eyes. The last few words were a warning. Do not speak the words aloud. Do not speak to the voice that calls. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, my pulse quickening, wondering if anyone else was in the room with me. The temperature seemed to drop. The shadows deepened. The sudden realization hit me like a physical blow. The voice, the one that had been calling me through the text, wasn't just in my head. It was here. The manuscript had drawn me in. And now it was alive, feeding on my thoughts, drawing me into its dark, twisted narrative. I slammed the book shut, but it felt heavier than before, as though it had absorbed part of my soul. Panic surged through me. I stood up, my chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle felt warm, almost too warm, as if someone or something was on the other side, pressing against it. I pressed my shoulder against the door, desperate to escape, but it held fast. I could hear the whispering now, louder, closer. It was coming from the manuscript, from the very walls themselves, as though the building had come alive, speaking to me in a language I could not understand but felt in every fiber of my being. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. And when I opened them again, the room had changed. The shelves around me seemed to stretch, the books on them shifting and growing into shapes that resembled figures from a forgotten past. The manuscript lay open on the table, its words now glowing faintly, as though alive, waiting to be read. I realized with growing horror that I had become part of the manuscript, that my very presence had been woven into its story. The voice now whispered directly into my mind. No longer a distant murmur but a clear, commanding presence. It told me to stay, to learn, to become one with the story. My knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed beside the manuscript, my hand hovering over the pages. I knew what it wanted. I could feel the pull of it, urging me to finish what had been started, to become the final chapter in its tale. With a trembling hand, I reached for the quill beside me, and as soon as my fingers touched it, the world around me blurred. I felt my thoughts fraying, becoming more distant. Grip tightened on me, pulling me deeper into its web. The words came faster now, flowing from the tip of the quill as though they were not my own. I was no longer in control. I was simply the vessel, the instrument through which the manuscript would complete its story. My surroundings began to shift again, the shadows growing longer, darker. The voices grew louder, now joined by a chorus of whispers from other figures, trapped within the pages. I realized with a sickening lurch that they were all writers, like me, lured in by the same promise of knowledge, of power, of creation. But now they were lost, their identities forever bound to the words they had written. As I continued to write, I could feel the last remnants of my own identity slipping away. The words, the stories, the characters. They began to consume me, erasing the person I had been. I was no longer just a writer. I was part of the manuscript, part of the dark legacy it had crafted over centuries. And as the final words left my pen, I felt myself fading, becoming one with the story, lost in the pages forever. The last thing I remember is the sound of a door opening and a figure standing in the doorway, watching me with hollow eyes. I tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. And then, nothing. I wonder now, as I sit here, if I will ever truly escape. If the manuscript will always have a part of me, hidden within its pages, waiting for the next writer to come. And when they do, they will hear the whispering, too. The call to write, to create, to become one with the story. The longer I stayed in the office, the more I felt like an intruder, as if the building itself was pressing in around me, aware of my every move. The manuscript, which once felt like an object of fascination, had begun to take on a more sinister nature. It no longer rested quietly on my desk, it seemed to pulse, as if it were waiting for me to open it. every time I looked away from it, I felt a compulsion to return. It wasn't long before I noticed something else. Whenever I tried to focus on something else, the text would pull me back. A whisper, faint and insistent, seemed to rise from the pages. It wasn't audible, but it vibrated in my chest, a sensation that I couldn't escape. I could almost hear the words, as though the manuscript itself were speaking directly to my mind. I would stare at the letters, trying to make sense of the jumbled characters, but the more I looked, the more they seemed to twist and turn, reshaping themselves into impossible forms. The change in my appearance was no longer subtle. One evening, as I caught my reflection in the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My skin was paler than I had ever remembered, and my eyes had a glassy sheen to them, like I was losing focus. As if the words of the manuscript had begun to fill the spaces in my mind. But it wasn't just my appearance, there was something off about my very presence. I felt like a hollow shell, barely tethered to my own body. It all came to a head one fateful night when I decided to confront that manuscript head-on. I couldn't keep avoiding it, it had become a part of me. And I had to know what it wanted. I sat down at my desk. The pages of the book spread out before me. The faint hum of the buildings, ancient systems echoed in the background as I stared at the page. The letters shifted before my eyes, slowly forming new words, new phrases. All of them seeming to call to me. I read aloud, a strange impulse urging me to speak the words, though they felt foreign, even dangerous. The moment I uttered the first phrase, the room seemed to tighten around me. The air grew thicker, heavy with an unseen pressure. The walls felt like they were moving inward, and the temperature dropped sharply, a chill that went deep into my bones. I could hear a faint whispering. Not from the book this time, but from somewhere deep within the walls themselves. Panic surged in me as I realized what was happening. I had unwittingly opened a door that could not be closed. The manuscript's words had changed me. I could feel it. My body was becoming less real, less human. I could see the transformation in my reflection. My skin had taken on the texture of old parchment. My fingers too long, too thin. It was as though I had been written into that book, my essence slowly being replaced by the manuscript's dark intent. Desperate, I slammed the manuscript shut, but it was too late. The feeling of being trapped inside the story was overwhelming, suffocating. The manuscript had consumed me, and now, no matter how much I struggled, I could feel myself slipping away, like ink bleeding into a page. My mind raced, desperate to break free, but the words, those damn words, kept pulling me back. I stumbled away from the desk, my vision flickering as the room seemed to warp around me. The shadows lengthened, and I could hear the whispering, growing louder now, filling the room, the hallway, the entire building. It was as though the walls were alive, responding to my attempts to erase them. Malevolent energy that the manuscript had given off. In my panic, I tried to escape, to flee the apartment. But every step felt heavier. My body was betraying me, as if it no longer belonged to me. The door to the hallway opened before I even touched the handle, as though some unseen force was guiding me out. The walls around me seemed to pulse, shifting like the ink of the manuscript, as if the building itself was alive and aware of my presence. I staggered into the street, gasping for breath, but the air felt thick and oppressive. The city around me seemed unreal, distorted. I could hear the faint rustling of pages in my mind, and the feeling of the manuscript's presence lingered. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed, that the manuscript's influence still had a hold on me, even in the open air. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape it. The manuscript, the book, has become a part of me now, as much a part of my thoughts as my own identity. It knows me, and I fear that it will continue to call me back, until I have fully faded into its pages. Every word I write now feels like a battle. Each sentence seems to carry a piece of me away, pulling me closer to whatever dark force is behind this cursed manuscript. And as much as I try to resist, I fear it's only a matter of time before the words claim me entirely. The dark ink on the paper seemed to mock me, as if it was trying to reveal a truth I wasn't ready to face. I wiped my hands on my sleeves, but the sensation of blood, real or imagined, lingered in my fingers. Each time I looked at the page, I could still see the faint outline of the symbols, as though they had burned themselves into the paper, waiting to re-emerge. My reflection in the window opposite my desk looked strange, too. The light seemed to flicker around me, casting shadows that I couldn't explain. I glanced at the clock, and time seemed to warp. It was as though the minutes stretched out, elongating in strange, unbearable ways. Every second felt like an eternity. The manuscript, now open before me, beckoned again. And despite the terror that gripped me, I couldn't resist. The words on the page weren't just symbols anymore. They had begun to form shapes in my mind, a tapestry of images too abstract and haunting to process fully. A woman with hollow eyes, a labyrinthine library stretching into infinity, and a figure, always watching, always waiting. I could hear the rhythmic pulse of chanting in my mind, though no one was speaking aloud. I needed to stop. I knew I needed to stop. But I couldn't. The manuscript had become a part of me, a force pulling me in deeper with each word I read. The unsettling changes in my body, the symbols on my skin, the eerie sense of déjà vu in my waking hours, it was all connected. There was something terrible in those pages, something ancient. And it had chosen me. The realization struck me with terrifying clarity. The manuscript wasn't just a text, it was a gateway, a link to something beyond comprehension. And I had unknowingly crossed its threshold. I felt its pull in my veins, a sensation that was both intoxicating and suffocating. It had already begun to rewrite me, to merge its power with my soul. That night, I had another dream. If you could even call it a dream. I found myself in the vast library I had seen before, but this time, the figures in the shadows weren't silent. They whispered, their words slipping under my skin like a cold, unrelenting current. The woman with hollow eyes stepped forward, her lips never moving, yet I could hear her voice in my mind. She spoke of transformation, of binding the soul to the text, of becoming part of something eternal. I woke with a start, the pressure in my chest unbearable. My hands were shaking, and I could still hear the echo of her words. Desperately, I reached for the manuscript, the only thing that could answer the questions swirling in my mind. The text had shifted again, new passages appearing, written in a language that wasn't quite foreign but not fully mine either. I felt myself slipping. My mind, my body, they were no longer mine to command. The manuscript had claimed me, had bound me to its will. I could see now that the woman with hollow eyes was no longer just a specter in my dreams. She was there, in the room with me, her presence like a cold breath on the back of my neck. As I looked at the manuscript one last time, I knew that whatever force had created it had fully consumed me. I could feel it in the depth of my soul, the transformation that had begun long before I realized. My reflection, distorted and unfamiliar, stared back at me from the surface of the desk, and in its eyes, I saw the woman's hollow gaze mirrored. The writing had stopped. I had finished what I was meant to do. But as I sat there, surrounded by the fragments of my own unraveling, I couldn't escape the terrifying thought, what now? What happens to those who are written into the story? And was I ever truly part of the world I had once known? Or had I already become something else entirely, just another name in the manuscript, waiting to fade into its endless pages? But I couldn't. Something deep inside me, perhaps a twisted sense of responsibility or a craving for closure, demanded that I keep it. The manuscript had already changed me, and I knew that if I destroyed it, I might lose whatever fragile grip I had on reality. So, I did the unthinkable, I locked it away. I buried it deep in the back of my closet, behind boxes I hadn't touched in years. The bag, heavy with the weight of forbidden knowledge, seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. But even in hiding, it didn't let me go. Every night, I could feel it calling to me from behind the closed door. I tried to live as normally as I could. But the shadows of the manuscript haunted me. The symbols on my skin persisted. Faint, but they were always there, just beneath the surface. Like a bruise that never quite healed. My dreams were filled with the hooded figure, its hands always reaching for me, always closer. Every time I woke, I was convinced it had followed me into the waking world. Its presence lingering in the room like a weight I couldn't shake. Weeks passed in a haze of exhaustion and anxiety. I began to feel disconnected. From everything around me, the faces of my colleagues blurred. The university's grand halls hollow and distant. Even the city of Coimbra, once vibrant and full of life, felt like a stage I was watching from a distance. Every street I walked seemed to stretch on endlessly. Like I was trapped in some cyclical nightmare, always returning to the same dark corner. One evening, in a fit of frustration, I went back to my closet. My hand shook as I pulled the bag from its hiding place. The manuscript, though wrapped in cloth, felt impossibly heavy in my grasp. I couldn't resist it any longer. I had to know what it wanted. I unfolded the cloth, the texture of the manuscript like an ancient relic that had seen centuries of history. The letters were unchanged, but they seemed to shift beneath my eyes. As I read, the world around me blurred. I felt my thoughts fraying, becoming more distant. As if I was no longer entirely present in my own body. The symbols on my skin burned, each one seeming to throb with the words I read. The more I read, the more I felt myself slipping, like I was losing pieces of myself. And in that moment, it became clear, the manuscript wasn't just a book. It was a curse, a living force that took what it needed, creativity, soul, mind, and twisted it into something else. I wasn't just translating a text. The text was transforming me. My reflection in the window, my own face, became unfamiliar. It was as though I was staring at a stranger. Someone who had absorbed all the knowledge and dread from the manuscript and was now being restructured into its image. The figure I had seen in my dreams was no longer just in my mind. It had taken shape in my world, in my life, through my own twisted reflections. But it wasn't enough to merely read it. It wanted more. I realized then that the manuscript's power wasn't simply in its content, it was in the act of giving itself to someone. And in doing so, it took a part of that person. I had willingly fed it. My thoughts, my soul, my essence, and it wanted to consume all of me. But something about the place unsettled me. The air felt heavier than it should. And the silence was oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Despite the odd sensation, I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the space. I needed a fresh start, and this apartment, with its stunning views of the ocean and minimalist design, seemed perfect. I moved in within a few days, eager to leave behind the weight of my past writing failures. The apartment was spacious, with white walls that reflected the light of the coast. At first, it felt peaceful, even liberating. But as the days wore on, I began to notice strange things. The temperature in certain rooms would drop inexplicably. and in the quiet of the night, I would hear faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I tried to brush it off as the sounds of the ocean or the wind in the nearby trees. But there was something too deliberate about the way the whispers seemed to call my name, or how the sound of my footsteps would be mirrored by a delay. It was as though the apartment was not only listening, but waiting, anticipating. The deeper I settled into my new life, the more I became aware of the uncanny feeling that lingered around me. I started to lose track of time. I would sit down to write, only to realize hours had passed, my fingers frozen over the keyboard, unable to form words. Other times, I would wake in the middle of the night to find the apartment dimly lit, though I had turned off all the lights before going to bed. One night, I woke up to find the room colder than usual. The ocean's roar outside was muffled by the thick, oppressive silence that had fallen over the apartment. I rose to get a drink of water. My footsteps muffled on the hardwood floors. As I passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, and it was off. For a split second, I could see someone standing behind me. Their figure distorted and blurry, just out of focus. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, the mirror reflecting only myself. Yet the unease that had been building in my chest intensified. And the whispers started again, faint and distant at first, then growing louder. The sound of my name, spoken by someone who was not me, echoed in the hall. That night, the whispers followed me into my dreams. I dreamt of the apartment, except it was different. The walls stretched impossibly tall, the ceilings higher than I had remembered. I wandered through endless hallways, each turn leading to another mirrored corridor, my footsteps always trailing behind me. In the dream, I came upon a door at the end of one of the hallways. Its frame jagged as though the building itself was breaking apart. I reached for the doorknob, and when I opened it, I was greeted by an overwhelming darkness. From within that darkness, a figure stepped forward, dressed in a cloak of shifting shadows. Their face was hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me, piercing through the veil of my own fear. The figure spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their voice resonating deep within my bones. But in that strange, unspoken way, I understood the message: you cannot escape what you have called. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. The ocean outside was muted, as though the world had swallowed its sound. And then, in the silence, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned slowly, but there was nothing there. Only the empty hall, stretching before me, endless and unyielding. The realization hit me with terrifying clarity. I had moved into this place to escape my past, to find inspiration for my writing, but what I had found instead was something that had been waiting for me. Something that thrived on the stories I had told, the words I had written. The apartment, the whispers, the strange figure, they were all tied to something I had unknowingly invited into my life. Now, I am not sure where the apartment ends and where I begin. I feel as though I am being drawn deeper into its mysteries, and every day, I lose more of myself to it. The whispers call to me still, and I have started to write again, though the words feel foreign, as though they are not entirely mine. I can't leave. I know that now. Whatever has been awakened here, whatever presence has taken hold, will not let me go. And so, I write, each word a tether to something I can't understand. Something that waits for me in the dark corners of the apartment. The door at the end of the hallway is always there, always open. And I know that one day, I will have to walk through it. Until then, I remain trapped, watching the shadows grow longer, listening for the footsteps that always follow, and wondering if this apartment will ever release its hold on me, or if I, like those who came before, will become just another part of its story. I stared at them for hours, unable to look away. The spirals in the plants seemed to move ever so slightly, like they were breathing, pulsing with some hidden rhythm. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was overreacting to the strange circumstances I had found myself in. But every time I touched one of the leaves, they felt unusually cold, as if they were channeling something beyond the ordinary. The oddities in the apartment didn't stop there. As time went on, I began to notice that the shadows in the room stretched longer than they should. I would sit at my desk, staring at my computer, only to glance up and find the sunlight outside had dimmed without my noticing. The once bright daylight would fade, and the air would grow inexplicably colder. The apartment felt as though it were being slowly suffocated by its own silence. One night, after another restless dream filled with fragmented images of the apartment shifting around me, I woke up to find my walls covered in strange marks. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But as I walked closer, I realized they were symbols, sharp, angular, and deeply etched into the walls. The marks resembled the patterns from the plants, twisted and spiraling, mirroring what I had seen in the leaves just days before. I tried to scrub them away with a damp cloth, but the marks only seemed to grow more pronounced as I wiped them down. It was as though the walls were alive, responding to my attempts to erase them. The more I struggled to clean them, the more the symbols deepened into the surface of the walls, as though they were being absorbed into the fabric of the apartment itself. Frantically, I called the landlord the next morning, hoping for some explanation. But when I went to check on the marks again, they were gone. The walls were smooth, untouched. It felt as though I had imagined the whole thing. But the unease lingered, like a weight in the air that refused to lift. It wasn't until I began reading through my manuscript again that I started to connect the dots. The strange patterns in the plants, the eerie presence in the walls, the odd sense of time slipping away. Everything seemed to be related to what I was writing. The more I tried to piece together the strange occurrences, the more the manuscript seemed to mirror them. The pages I had written began to feel like a diary of events that hadn't happened yet, things that were only beginning to manifest. One evening, as I sat in front of my computer, I saw something I couldn't ignore. The text on the screen began to shift, rearranging itself before my eyes. The sentences I had written weeks ago now read differently, as if they were being rewritten by an invisible hand. Words that I hadn't typed appeared on the screen, details about things I hadn't yet experienced, descriptions of conversations and events that hadn't come to pass. Panic surged through me. I shut the laptop, my hands shaking violently. This wasn't just writer's block or an overactive imagination. Something in the apartment, something tied to the manuscript, was warping my reality. It was as though the lines between my writing and the world around me had begun to blur, each word I wrote feeding the forces that were slowly taking hold of me. The following day, I could no longer deny it. The apartment had become a reflection of the story I had been trying to create. The walls, the plants, the very air around me, they were all becoming part of the narrative, and I was trapped within it. The apartment wasn't just my home anymore. It was the setting for something darker, something that had latched onto me the moment I stepped inside. The manuscript had changed me, but not in the way I had hoped. It had twisted my perception of reality, binding me to something that I couldn't escape. As the days passed, I began to feel less like myself, my thoughts slipping away as I found myself drawn deeper into the strange occurrences around me. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind, or if the apartment itself was feeding on me. My reflection became more distorted with each passing day. In the mirror, I saw myself, but I also saw something else, a shadow, a figure, watching me from behind. And every time I turned to face it, it disappeared. Desperation set in. I had to leave, but every time I tried, something held me back. The apartment had become a part of me, and I had become a part of it. I could feel the walls pushing in on me, closing me off from the outside world. And deep down, I knew I had already written myself into the story, a story that had no end. The voices were clearer now, like whispers carried through water. Almost indecipherable but filled with an unsettling rhythm. It sounded like a conversation, but not one I could follow. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with a kind of energy I could feel in my bones. I listened harder, trying to catch one word. One sentence that would give me a clue as to what was happening. But instead, the murmur grew louder, more urgent, and then it stopped. A complete silence followed, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, motionless, my ears still pressed against the wall. The quiet stretched on, unbearable, until I thought I might crack under its weight. And then, suddenly, a single word rang through the air, as clear as if it had been spoken directly into my ear: finish. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The word echoed in my mind, and a cold chill swept through me. It was the first time I had heard a direct command, and it sent a ripple of fear through every nerve in my body. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew this was different. The voices had always been there. An unsettling background hum, but now they had a purpose. It was as though they were guiding me, urging me to finish the story I had started, no matter the cost. Every time I hesitated, every time I thought of stopping, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They were in the very air I breathed, and I was no longer sure where I ended. And the apartment began. I went back to my desk, hands trembling as I opened the manuscript. The words seemed to have a life of their own, flowing onto the pages with an unnatural speed. It was as if the story was writing itself, as though the apartment itself were shaping the narrative. Each time I typed, I felt a strange pull in my chest, as though the story were anchoring me to this place. The more I wrote, the more reality bent around me. Characters I created moved in the streets, living out their fictional lives. I saw one of my characters standing by the cafe I had described earlier, gazing at the window as if waiting for something. I followed the figure, my pulse racing, and found myself standing before a staircase that led down into the factories. Before, my grip on reality began to slip. Was I dreaming? Was I awake? The line between the world I was writing and the world I was living in became impossible to distinguish. The whispers never stopped. They grew louder as I typed, louder as I breathed, as if the entire apartment had become one living, breathing entity, feeding off the words I wrote. And then it happened. The one moment that broke me. I glanced into the mirror, and for the briefest of seconds, I didn't see myself. I saw the figure I had described in my manuscript, standing behind me. Its face obscured by shadow, but its presence was unmistakable. Turn. The reflection moved on its own, twisting and contorting, until it reached out, as if trying to touch me. I turned away, heart hammering in my chest, but the image stayed with me, burned into my mind. That was the moment I realized I had crossed a line. A line that had been drawn in invisible ink, written by the apartment itself. I wasn't just writing the story anymore, I was becoming part of it. The apartment had claimed me, and with each word I wrote, I fed it, making it more real, making it more dangerous. My every thought was consumed by the story, by the apartment, by the voices. I could no longer tell where the world ended and my creation began. The whispers had turned into commands, and I was no longer in control. I was a vessel for something far older, far darker than I could have ever imagined. The apartment had become my prison, and the manuscript was my chain. I kept writing, because I had no choice. It demanded completion, and I knew deep down that if I stopped, the consequences would be worse than anything I could imagine. The apartment would consume me completely, and the world outside would become nothing more than a distant memory, a figment of a story I could no longer touch. And so I wrote, with the walls closing in, with the whispers growing louder, until there was nothing left but the sound of my fingers on the keys, and the creeping darkness that followed every word. I woke up the next morning with a deep sense of relief, convinced that I had left the horrors behind. The apartment, the voices, the distorted reality, it all felt like it belonged to someone else's nightmare. Now, I felt normal again, the weight that had pressed down on me for so long finally lifted. But as I went about my day, I began to notice small things. I kept hearing faint rustlings in the distance, like paper turning or soft whispers. I tried to ignore them, chalking it up to my still jangled nerves. Yet, as the day wore on, it became harder to dismiss. In a cafe later that afternoon, I saw an old man reading a newspaper. The headline read, "Author missing after mysterious disappearance. Manuscript found." My stomach dropped. The article detailed my exact disappearance, with a strange reference to a manuscript found in the abandoned apartment building. The description was eerily accurate, as though it had been pulled directly from my own writing. The city, the building, even the bizarre changes, everything. I felt the cold dread return, crawling down my spine. Was it possible that the apartment still had its grip on me? I hurried back to the hotel, my mind racing with possibilities. How had the story I wrote about escaping found its way into the real world? Was it simply a coincidence, or was I still somehow part of the narrative I had tried to end? My reflection in the hotel mirror looked pale and tired, and I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun this. The story was still unfolding, and I was no longer sure who was controlling it. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard the faintest sound. A whisper that felt like it came from the shadows themselves. It was the same voice I had heard before, but this time it was not a murmur in the walls, it was in my head. "You can't escape," it whispered, its tone a cold, distant promise. I jumped out of bed, trembling, and grabbed my laptop. I opened the manuscript file. The last sentence I had written, the one about escaping the apartment, was still there, but now, it was different. The words had rearranged themselves, and now they read, "The author steps into the world, but the world steps into him." My breath caught in my throat. It was as though the story had rewoven itself, reaching beyond the page, wrapping itself around my existence. The lines between fiction and reality blurred once more, and the apartment, the manuscript, the voices, they were still with me. I had thought I was free, but the truth was that I had never truly escaped. The apartment had never truly let go. I sat there in silence, my mind racing with horror and confusion. The world outside seemed unchanged, but deep down, I knew better now. The apartment was still calling to me, still writing my story, still shaping my reality. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many names I assumed, it would always find me. The story would always find me. And so, I continue to write. Not because I want to, but because I must. The words are no longer my own. They belong to something darker, something far more powerful. And the apartment, with its shifting walls and whispering shadows, will always be there, waiting for the next chapter to begin. I tried to push past the growing unease, reminding myself of the stories I'd read about old, decaying places playing tricks on the mind. But as I moved deeper into the factory, the atmosphere shifted. The silence, once almost comforting in its emptiness, now felt like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating the air around me. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the way the space seemed to swallow every echo, as if it were hiding something. My next steps were hesitant. Each photograph now felt like an intrusion, as if I were disturbing something that had long been forgotten, or perhaps something that was never meant to be uncovered. Yet I couldn't stop. I wanted to see what was hidden, to capture the truth of this forsaken place. But the deeper I ventured, the more unsettling the images became. One shot, in particular, stopped me cold. The photograph showed a large room with towering shelves, each one filled with dusty textiles. But in the frame, just beyond the shelves, there was something or someone watching me. The figure was pale and indistinct, as though it had been superimposed into the image. It stood too still, its face obscured by shadow, but its presence was unmistakable. I turned to look into the room. The space was empty, save for the stacks of fabric, but the air had thickened. I felt as if I were being observed, not by a person, but by something more ancient, more aware. My breath grew shallow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. I took a few more steps, my footsteps louder in the silence, and found myself standing before a staircase that led down into the factory's lower levels. My gut told me to leave, to walk out the way I came. But curiosity gripped me. I had to know. The factory had secrets, and I had come too far to turn back without uncovering them. So, with a shaky breath, I descended the stairs. The lower level was even darker, the only light coming from the dim glow of my camera's screen. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I set up my next shot, my hands unsteady as I aimed the lens. That's when I saw it, another figure. This time clearer than before. It was sitting on the floor, its back hunched, its limbs twisted in impossible angles. It looked like it was staring directly at me, though its eyes were hollow, empty. I snapped the photo. But when I looked at the image on the screen, there was nothing there. The figure had disappeared, as though it had never been there at all. I felt a cold chill wash over me, and the air around me seemed to tighten, pressing in. My body was frozen, not from fear but from the overwhelming sense that I had crossed a line, that I had witnessed something that I should not have seen. I backed away slowly, the sound of my retreating steps suddenly deafening in the silence. The deeper I went into the factory, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape this place before it could trap me. But as I turned to head back up the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The stairs I had descended now appeared different, as if they were part of a different space entirely. The walls that had been solid brick were now covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor covered in layers of dust. I hesitated. This wasn't how it had looked before. I was sure of it. The building had changed. But how? And why did it feel like I wasn't just in an abandoned factory anymore? It was as though I had wandered into a place that didn't exist in any logical way, a place suspended outside time, where the past and present collided. I rushed up the stairs, but the hallway above was now different too. The familiar door I had entered through was gone, replaced by another hallway, leading to a room I didn't recognize. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. I wasn't alone. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that I had to get out. My heart raced, my feet stumbled over the uneven floor. And the sound of those footsteps grew louder, faster, as though someone or something was chasing me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was no longer the factory I had entered, but something darker, a place that had been waiting for me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled back into the main courtyard, the rusted gates looming ahead of me. I pushed through them and didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the nearest street. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. And I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. There was nothing. Just the empty stretch of land, the factory looming in the distance, silent and still as it had always been. But something inside me had shifted. I couldn't forget the faces, the figures, the twisted limbs and the hollow eyes. I had entered a place that should never have been explored. A place that had touched me in ways I didn't fully understand. That night, I locked the doors to my apartment and couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. The next morning, I burned the photographs I had taken, all of them. Every last one. I couldn't risk leaving any trace of the factory, any record of what I had seen. But as I watched the flames consume the images, I couldn't shake the sense that they were already burned into my memory, that no amount of fire could erase what I had witnessed. The factory, its secrets, and the figures that haunted it had already become a part of me, and no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that the whispers would follow me. They would always be there, just out of reach, just behind me in the darkness. The story I had tried to capture was not over yet. And for me, it was never truly finished. The looms, rusted and silent, stood like ancient sentinels, their threads long since tangled and broken. The oppressive gloom thickened, and it felt as though the air itself was pushing against me, urging me deeper into the factory's forgotten bowels. My heartbeat echoed in the cavernous space, and the once familiar sound of my footsteps was now muffled, swallowed up by the shadows that stretched endlessly before me. I tried to steady my breath, but the more I wandered, the more disoriented I became. The factory seemed alive with an invisible presence, a growing sense that the walls were shifting around me. The space no longer adhered to any logical architecture. Hallways looped back on themselves, and doors opened into rooms that had no right to exist. I had no idea how long I had been inside or how far I had wandered. It was in one of these moments of confusion, when I thought I had found a familiar doorway, that I realized something that made my blood run cold. The mannequins had followed me. I hadn't heard them move, but when I checked the photographs on my camera, their positions had changed again. They were closer now, clustered together as if silently awaiting my next move. In one photo, I could just make out the pale face of a mannequin peering out from behind the others, its eyes locked on me. Panic surged through me. My head spun, and my legs felt weak, as if the factory itself was draining my strength with every step I took. I knew I had to leave. But no matter which way I turned, I only found more corridors. More twisted halls, all leading back to the same haunting figures. The silence of the building was now oppressive, the whispering voices louder than ever, filling my ears with garbled sounds that felt like they were trying to tell me something I was desperately afraid to hear. Finally, I made my way back to the room with the mannequins. I thought perhaps if I retraced my steps, I might find an exit or some kind of escape. But as I reached the doorway, the air around me seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped. The mannequins were no longer still. They were arranged in a half circle, their faces turned toward me. Their cracked, lifeless eyes seemed to glimmer in the dim light, and the shadows around them twisted unnaturally, as if they were reaching for me. A single figure stepped forward from the group. Its limbs long and contorted, its body too thin and elongated. I recognized it instantly. It was the same figure I had seen in my photographs earlier. It stood there, in the center of the room, as though waiting for me to make the next move. My heart thudded in my chest, and for the first time, I felt truly terrified. Not because of what I could see, but because of what I couldn't. I turned and bolted down the corridor, each step echoing louder than the last. The building seemed to distort further. With every breath I took, I was trapped in a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and twisted shapes, and I had no idea how to escape. The once familiar factory now felt like a living nightmare, with shadows that moved and whispers that followed. I stumbled through one final doorway, only to find myself back in the main courtyard, but it was different. The sky was darker, the air thick with a strange mist. The factory walls loomed around me, as though they were closing in. And then I saw it at the far end of the courtyard, standing in the center, was the figure. It was waiting for me, its eyes glinting in the fog. A sickening realization washed over me. I hadn't been alone in the factory all along. The building, the mannequins, the voices, it was all part of something much larger. Something I had unwittingly stepped into. I was no longer just a visitor. I had become part of the factory's history, its twisted, unfinished story. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The figure advanced, its limbs stretching impossibly long as it glided toward me. I could feel its presence, its coldness, closing in. And just as I reached the entrance, the world seemed to stop. The factory, the figures, the whispers, they were all frozen, suspended in time, as though waiting for something to happen. But I knew, deep down, that there would be no escape. I had written myself into this nightmare, and there was no ending to be found. The story had no conclusion, no closure. It would continue on, in the shadows, in the spaces between breaths, forever haunting me.